GBNews, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
As time passes,
she could have said storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
It went everywhere.
something practical could be done.
I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
this is the nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
A very, very good afternoon to you. It's 3 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News, broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster, all across the UK. On today's show, after scrapping the Rwanda bill on day one, today the Labour Party has dramatically axed the Bibi Stockholm. Our asylum seeker camps at RAF Scampton and RAF Wethersfield next for the chop. But with no signs of illegal immigration coming down anytime soon, where will they all be housed? Could they be coming to a street near you? Next up, Islamist hate preacher Anjem Choudary is facing life in jail after being found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. Choudary, who once boasted he was the #1 radicaliser in Britain, will be sentenced a week today. And the BBC has published its annual Fat Cat salary list, and no surprises, once again Gary Lineker as top of the table on £1.35 million every year. But Hugh Edwards, who didn't even work last year due to suspension, he also trousered a 40 grand pay rise. On the back of all this, is it time to scrap the BBC licence fee? And that's all coming in your next hour. Welcome to the show. I think this afternoon we've seen a massive direction of travel of where the Labour Party's asylum seeker programme is going. Bibi Stockholm scrapped, Rwanda scrapped, RF Wethersfield and Scampton, they're under review. I predict they'll be scrapped. They're scrapping the hotel idea. What's left? The answer is housing. Social housing or houses near you. Could we be looking at Serco on steroids? Angela Rayner promised that every constituency would have to take its fair share of asylum seekers. It's today's announcement on the Bibi Stockholm a surefire giveaway that will be the case. Big topic to discuss throughout the show. Get in touch, gbnews.com/your say. But before we get kicked off, it's your headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Martin, thank you. Good afternoon. From the GB newsroom at 3:02, your top story this hour. The government will shut down a barge used for housing migrants off the south coast of England as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. Use of the Bibi Stockholm, which can house up to 500 men, began under the Conservative government, but human rights campaigners compared it to a prison ship and criticised its use as inhumane. Extending the use of the Bibi Stockholm would have cost more than £20 million next year. Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. His trial found that he directed the group for a significant period starting in 2014 and had also encouraged support at online meetings of the Islamic Thinkers Society. Dominic Murphy is head of counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police. He says today's verdict marks an important moment.
We know that Anjem Choudhary's had involvement with individuals that have committed terrorist attacks here in the UK in the past, but also travelled overseas to join ISIS So actually disrupting Anjem Choudary and, of course, his group, Al Muhajiroon, a prescribed organisation here under the Terrorism Act in the UK, will help us to manage public safety. But of course, we need to keep a watchful eye on others that are involved in radicalisation. So our work won't stop here, but this is nonetheless a significant milestone.
Meanwhile, in the US, attention is turning to who Kamala Harris may pick as her running mate, as she asserts herself as the presumed nominee to face Donald Trump. On her first full day in the race, many of those once tipped to challenge the vice president instead threw their support behind her. That paved the way for her campaign to raise around $81 million just a day after President Biden dropped out. It comes as party members and supporters commend Mr. Biden's decision, including the actor George Clooney, who said he'd saved democracy. Back in the UK, a police officer has been stabbed in the chest at a prison. The officer is conscious and talking in hospital following the incident, which happened this morning at Franklin Prison. That's according to Durham Police. He was visiting the Category A men's prison from an outside force. Now, water companies will be expected to do far more to protect the health of Britain's waterways when new powers are given to the regulator. The Environment Secretary says a promised crackdown on water firms will include tougher fines for polluting and ensuring money is properly invested into infrastructure rather than paid out in bonuses. The Environment Agency reported 47 serious pollution incidents last year, up from 44 in 2022. Steve Reed says that's unacceptable.
It would cost hundreds of billions of pounds to nationalise the water companies, and it would take years to unravel the current ownership models. I want to crack on and clean up the water as fast as we can. That is best done by giving the regulator the power, the teeth they need to stop these practices, and that includes the powers to make water bosses responsible for illegal pollution face criminal charges for the law breaking for which they are responsible.
James Cleverly has told GB News that would-be illegal migrants were praying for a Labour government because it would mean the end of the Rwanda plan. The Shadow Home Secretary said the government had behaved in an arrogant manner, accusing them of tearing up the Conservatives' migrant plan without informing Rwanda. His comments come as the Tories set out a timeline for confirming a replacement for Rishi Sunak as the party's leader. But Mr. Cleverly says, for now, his focus is elsewhere.
Well, I've always believed that you should do the jobs that you need to do in the order that you need to do them. So nominations open tomorrow. So thoughts and activities about the leadership of the party, in my mind, start tomorrow. Today's work is about making sure that I discharge my duty as the Shadow Home Secretary. I'll be at the dispatch box later on today, holding the new Home Secretary to account.
Police investigating disturbances in the Hare Hills area of Leeds last week say they've made a total of 20 arrests. The riots are believed to have been linked to a case involving local children who were taken into care. Vehicles could be seen on fire, while a police car was also overturned. West Yorkshire Police say the fast-paced investigation continues and they've identified 40 suspects. One of the world's greatest tennis champions will say au revoir after the Paris Olympics. Andy Murray has announced that this year's Games will be his last ever tennis tournament. He was recently denied a Wimbledon farewell in the singles after he had surgery on a spinal cyst just a week before the tournament began. In a post on social media, he said that competing for Team GB has been by far the most memorable weeks of his career, and he's proud to do it one final time. Scotland's First Minister John Swinney hailed Murray as our greatest ever sportsman. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
And au revoir, Sophia. Now we begin with the huge news that the government will end the use of the Bibby Stockholm barge for housing migrants off England's south coast as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. The contract for the barge, moored in Dorset, will not be renewed past January, as demand for such accommodation will be reduced by moves to clear the asylum backlog, as announced by the Home Office. The vessel was one of several sites, including the military bases RAF Wethersfield in Essex and, of course, RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, used by the previous Tory government in a bid to cut the costs of housing migrants in hotels. And we're joined now by our Homeland Security editor, Mark White. Mark, welcome to the show. So Rwanda scrapped on day one. The Bibi Stockholm scrapped. Huge question marks over RAF Wethersfield and Scampton. That in itself, Mark, poses huge questions. Immigration isn't coming down. Asylum isn't coming down. Illegal immigration isn't coming down. This problem isn't going away. They've just basically solved where they're going to deal with it, but the problem hasn't gone.
No, I think this is the clearest indication yet of the direction of travel of the new Labour government when it comes to dealing with the asylum crisis. Rwanda, well, that's one thing, of course, the decision to not put people over to Rwanda as part of a deterrent to try to stop boats coming across the channel. Actually dealing with the asylum problem here and the backlog in this country, the fact that the Bibi Stockholm is no longer going to operate to house these asylum seekers from January of next year when that contract is up for renewal. And the fact, we think, in the coming weeks or months that the government is also going to announce that RAF Scampton up in Lincolnshire and the former RAF base at Wethersfield in Essex will also no longer house asylum seekers, gives you an indication of what this government is planning to do, and that is to clear the asylum backlog, to stop putting people into accommodation like these larger scale accommodation centres, and of course the many hundreds of hotels that have been requisitioned for use by asylum seekers by the Conservative government over recent years, which has seen a bill of some £8 million a year being put towards asylum accommodation. The new government says this is no longer acceptable, but their way of dealing with it is to rapidly go through these asylum applications so that they're taking people out of asylum accommodation by either granting them asylum or, if not granting them asylum, removing them to their country of origin if they can. But we know that the vast majority of people coming over in small boats are actually coming from countries where it's incredibly difficult to return them to, like Iran or Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. So with those people, what you do is they get interim leave to remain and then probably permanent leave to remain after that, indefinite leave to remain it's called. And they are effectively people that have been granted asylum anyway, and they're absorbed into the wider community. So that's the clear policy, stated policy of the government going forward, Martin.
Mark, you've absolutely nailed it. Angela Rayner said on the 26th of June, every part of Britain will take their fair share of migrants. Mark White, this is the clearest indication yet. If there are no barges, if there are no airfields, if there are no hotels, the only thing left is housing, either to build housing or to hoover up cheap housing to stick them in a community coming to you soon.
Indeed, and another statement from a government minister that just backs up what you're saying there. This time comes from the new Border Security and Asylum Minister, Dame Angela Eagle MP. Remember her from the previous Labour government, back in there at the Home Office. And she said in response to the decision not to renew the Bibi Stockholm contract that it would save £20 million over the next year. And she said, we are determined to restore order to the asylum system so that it operates swiftly. The operative word there, swiftly, firmly and fairly, and ensures that the rules are properly enforced. And then goes on to say the Home Secretary has set out plans to start clearing the asylum backlog and making savings on accommodation, which is running up vast bills to the taxpayer. So that is it, the clearest indication yet of what the Labour government wants to do, which is clear the asylum backlog, get them out of that interim accommodation situation which is so upsetting people all across the country, understandably so, when hundreds of hotels are taking out of service for local communities. That will now, at some point in the near future, we think, end, and these hotels will be returned to the local community. That will be welcomed on the one hand, but the flip side of that is these many thousands of people who've been in the hotels are, as you just mentioned, going to have to be absorbed into the local community, into local authority care. Local authorities right up and down the country will now have to take responsibility for these individuals. And what will that mean? That will mean that these people will have to be given the likes of social housing that is increasingly being denied to local people in local communities will be even more scarce in the months ahead.
Mark White succinctly put, and I think this is the problem that hasn't been solved. It's merely a problem that's been moved. Thank you very much, Mark White. Superb summary as ever. I can now get the view of the No to the Barge campaigner, Kate Robson. Kate, welcome to the show. Kate, let's start with the good news. No doubt you must be delighted today to learn that the Bibby Stockholm will no longer be housing asylum seekers in your neighbourhood. Is Kate Robson there?
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Kate Robson. Yeah, I was just saying, so let's start with the good news. You must be delighted after months and months of campaigning, months and months of protesting peacefully in a respectful manner. You must be delighted that the barge isn't going ahead. Let's start with the good news in your community first, Kate Robson.
I mean, well, absolutely. Ecstatic but mired. It's bittersweet because there is no plan B. So at the end of the day, the Bibby Stockholm was completely untenable on paper based on cost alone. We were looking at £54,000 per migrant annually to keep one on there. That's a family of four salary. I mean, it was just completely untenable. It's a treacherous use of taxpayers' money. I think the fact that Labour have shut down the Bibby Stockholm, they seem to have made an awful lot of decisions that just seem to be asserting their power. And some of those decisions are questionable. And it feels to me that they're not thinking about the fallout down the line. And like you've said, where are these people going to go? They're going to be processed. And this is great news for our town that the Bibby is going. But it's also good news for those migrants that are perhaps on the French coast that are awaiting to come over, because they now know that they're going to face a much better chance of being processed more quickly and gaining asylum in the UK. Just for example, in Dorset, we have 10,000 people on the housing list. We have families gnarled up in the B&B system, 4 or 5 people in a room. Some families don't actually have cooking facilities and they have to vacate their rooms between about 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock during the day. Our level of living standards is being pushed further down, and it's all to do with capacity. It's basic maths. Labour is saying they're going to build 1.5 million houses, but how are we going to service those houses? We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the GPs, we don't have the waterworks for a start. I was absolutely horrified yesterday to hear that large developers have been given the go-ahead to build houses and then sort the sewerage works out afterwards. I mean, it just seems to me that the decisions are being made not in the interest of the British people. And we need a huge reset. The Bibby Stockholm is it was a tiny, a fraction of the problem.
Kate, if I could interject, Kate, what always struck me as a deep irony about the situation around the Bibby Stockholm is that both yourselves as locals and the so-called anti-racists who turned up, oftentimes not from your community but from outside, activists, you agreed on one thing, and that was the huge strain placed on communities by a large number of asylum seekers being dumped upon them. And yet today's decision doesn't solve the root cause of that, does it, Kate Robson? It just moves the issue. If we're getting rid of RAF bases, which looks likely, scrapping hotels, also talked about, Bibby Stockholm, now history. Angela Rayner said every part of Britain will take its fair share of migrants. There's a very strong chance that while you may not be getting asylum seekers in a barge in your community, you might instead be getting them in cheap housing paid for by the taxpayer.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you prioritise people? You know, we know that there's people really struggling in this area. I think that, the government prior has obviously put this Bibby stock home there to act as a deterrent. And actually, it's absolutely fine. They have a pretty good quality of life on there, and quite a lot of voluntary services, which was costing an awful lot of money, and the disparity in the town compared to some of the local community that are struggling to put hand to mouth and relying on food banks is absolutely abhorrent. And what we have to realise is when these guys are given asylum, they then have the right to bring over their immediate family, potentially children, wives, parents even, and then it's all extra pressure on our services. I just cannot see a means to an end. I don't know what the long-term thoughts are. I don't know how they're going to I guess, give everybody the right level of standard of living without, there doesn't seem to be any transparency as what the end game is. And you just can't keep adding to a population without improving the infrastructure, because there's only few things that we rely on as human beings, and that's security, healthcare and stability, and none of that is a given anymore.
OK, Kate Robson, thank you very much. As you said, I think that was succinctly put, a bittersweet message. The No to the Barge campaigner, Kate Robson. Bibby Stockholm won't go ahead in your town, but doesn't necessarily get to the root of the problem. Thank you very much. Now let's cross live to the House of Commons, where Nigel Farage has been speaking. Not live, but he was speaking earlier.
I call Nigel Farage to make his maiden speech.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. I believe it's customary in a maiden speech to pay tribute to your predecessor, which I'm very happy to do. Giles Watling, a very decent, nice, honourable man, former actor, wears his Garrick Club tie, nothing even vaguely conservative about him, but a jolly nice chap, and it was a clean fought campaign. The Right Honourable Member for Holland and South Deepings earlier made reference to Clacton as being the place for a traditional English seaside holiday, and indeed it is, with its pier and its miles of sandy beaches and its arcades, and perhaps it's not the holiday that's as popular as it used to be now that people go to Spain and elsewhere, but it's still there. There are other parts of the constituency that are genteel, quite wealthy, but if we go to places like Jaywick, we find the most deprived community in the whole of the United Kingdom. Those communities have little faith or trust or belief that government can make their lives better. Indeed, what I found knocking on doors were people saying, we want to work, we want to get on, we want to make money. But as soon as we work for 16 hours a week or more, our benefits get taken away. We're better off staying on benefits. And I have to say, I feel immensely sorry for people who the benefit system, which is designed to help them, is actually keeping them trapped in levels of relative poverty. So I will do my best as the MP for the area to bring business investment, private money into the constituency with jobs and training and skills. I can't promise that I'll do it, but I will do my absolute damnedest to make it happen. Now, it's funny because I spent nearly 21 years as a member of the European Parliament in Brussels and with its monthly journey to Strasbourg. And I have to say, this place is very different indeed. It's smaller. There is not a chauffeur-driven Mercedes available for each member. No large lump sums of money which you don't have to spend on anything and show no receipts for. And I wonder whether perhaps that's why so many in the British political system seem to adore the European Union so much, because it is a rather wonderful place to work. What I perhaps didn't expect was to come here and to find that I'm more outnumbered with my reform team, more outnumbered here than we were in the European Parliament, because there are more supporters of Brexit in the European Parliament than I sense there are in this Parliament of 2024. This is very much a Remainers Parliament. I suspect in many cases it's really a Rejoiners Parliament. But the other issue, and it's very interesting as we debate the King's speech, if you look at the speech itself, the word immigration is mentioned only twice, and asylum just once. And perhaps this is not a surprise, as when Sir Keir Starmer laid out the 6 big priorities for the general election for the Labour Party, he didn't mention legal or illegal immigration. And that's the other area in which I think the 5 of us sitting over here are going to find ourselves massively outnumbered in this House, is because we actually do want to talk about these issues. You see, I believe that the population explosion is having the biggest impact on the quality of life of ordinary folk than any other issue. It all started, of course, when the current Home Secretary became a Member of Parliament back in May '97. And it's worth reminding ourselves that net migration was the same during the late 1940s, the whole of the 1950s, the whole of the 1960s, the whole of the 1970s, the whole of the 1980s, and the 1990s up until Mr. Blair. Net migration had run at 30 to 50,000 a year for over half a century. Then Mr. Blair gets in and decides we're going to open the doors in a way that had never been done before, to the delight and joy of big companies, and especially giant multinationals, who have always wanted as much cheap labour as they can get, and to hell with the consequences for working class families and people. But perhaps it was even more of a surprise to see that that massive acceleration in our population through immigration was then by a Conservative Party who, despite promises in 4 consecutive manifestos, actually accelerate what had happened under the years of Mr. Blair. And so we see a population increase of 10 million people since that time that Labour won its last landslide. Even the net figure is a migrant a minute. Even during the course of this debate, many hundreds more people will come to our country. And nobody is making the argument that there aren't some exceptionally wonderful people among them. There are, of course. But the sheer level of population means we have to build a new house every 2 minutes. Even if the Labour government is able to fulfil the 1.5 million houses that it wants to build during the lifetime of this Parliament, it will make no dent at all on the current shortage of housing. Rents have risen by 25% since 2021. Why? Population increase and pressure. And the list goes on through access to health services, to congestion, to pressure on infrastructure. The population crisis is the biggest impact affecting people's lives, damaging their quality of life, and virtually nobody in this place even wants to talk about it. But perhaps it's on illegal immigration that I do really want to make a point. 4 years ago, I went out into the English Channel repeatedly, filming dinghies coming across the channel, dinghies with an average of 16 people per boat. I was described as being a sad, lonely, desperate figure, always seeking attention. And I've no doubt there are some that think that's still the case today.
Spot on.
Thank you. But I did it because it was obvious to me what was going to happen. It was obvious that there would be a huge influx of people illegally coming to Britain across the English Channel. And it would happen because we'd stopped deporting people who came to Britain illegally. And perhaps the Labour Party might want to reflect themselves on the last period of Labour government, where we had Home Secretaries like David Blunkett, far, far to the right of people like the Shadow Home Secretary today. You came to Britain illegally, During the last Labour government, your feet didn't touch the sides. You were gone, you were out. Indeed, in the last year of the Labour government, from 2009 to 10, 50,000 people who came here illegally were deported. Now, none of that happens anymore. It didn't happen under 14 years of Conservatives, and it clearly isn't going to happen under this Labour government. And I wonder why. I think you'll find it's the increased role of a court overseas that was set up in the wake of World War II with the very, very best of intentions that has now completely outlived its usefulness. It is, of course, called the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, and it was the Labour government that enshrined the convention into British law. We will not stop the boats, even if we send a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade, with no success whatsoever. Yeah. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang 2 to 3 million euros a week. Whatever prison sentences or penalties are put upon them, there will always be people volunteering to make millions of euros a week. We will only stop this if we start deporting people that come illegally. Then they won't pay the smugglers. But we'll only do that by leaving the ECHR. But I've got a fun suggestion that I think would liven up politics, engage the public, and see a massively increased turnout. Why don't we have a referendum on whether we continue to be members of the ECHR?
I called Lola McAvoy to make her maiden speech.
Well, that was Nigel Farage in his maiden speech in rip-roaring form. Has to be said, a quick summary of what he just said in the Commons if you're joining us. He said, what I didn't expect is that I'm more outnumbered here than I was in the European Union. There were more supporters of Brexit in Brussels than in this Parliament. In fact, he said, this is a Remainers Parliament. Then going on to say, this is a Rejoiners Parliament. He then talks about the population explosion in Britain is the single biggest issue affecting people, especially the working classes. It's having a bigger impact on British people's quality of life than any other issue. Then blasted Tony Blair for opening our borders, but then praised Blair's government under David Blunkett for deporting people who came here illegally faster than their feet could touch the floor. And then he said that won't happen under this Labour government, and I'll tell you why. The ECHR, we will not stop the boats by attempting to stop criminal gangs. The financial rewards at 2 to 3 million euros every week are simply too high. The first speech from Nigel Farage, I suspect, of many. He's already making a huge impact. Moving on, notorious Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation and encouraging support for it through online meetings. Let's get the latest now with our GBNews national reporter Charlie Peters outside News Scotland Yard. Charlie Peters, finally Anjem Choudary has been served some justice. Tell us more.
Well, Martin, disrupting al-Muhajirun and its radicalising effects has been a key objective of Britain's counter-terrorism community for many decades. The group was founded in the 90s by an Islamist called Omar Bakri Mohammed, and he had run the organisation from Britain until it was proscribed in 2010. At that point, he left the country, he went to Lebanon and was imprisoned in 2014. It was from that period that the prosecution from the Crown Prosecution Service said that Anjem Choudary, that notorious Islamist preacher, had taken over in a sort of caretaker role while Omar Bakri Mohammed was in prison. They struggled to prove this for many years. Anjem Choudary has been a trained lawyer and he's always been careful to err on the right side of the law in his perspective and avoid prosecution. That came to an end in 2016 where he was jailed for 2 years for supporting the Islamic State, a terror group that was rampaging through Iraq and Syria at the time. He was released in 2018, but his licence conditions continued until 2021. After those conditions ended, He then started to give lectures, online lectures, often on encrypted platforms, to another group called the Islamic Thinkers Society. This group, based in North America, the prosecution said was, in any ways, and any other way of understanding it, ALM North America. ITS and ALM, as they said, were one and the same. And in order to prove this, to demonstrate that Anjem Choudary was not only a member of a terrorist organisation, not only encouraging support for a terrorist organisation, but directing al-Muhajiroon, they achieved this through links, undercover officers with the New York Police Department and the Canadian Mounted Police, because they infiltrated the Islamic Thinkers Society and managed to develop a network of connections with one key person in particular, Khaled Hussein, who's also been found guilty today, a Canadian national, of being a member of a proscribed terrorist organisation, that is al-Muhajiroon, via the Islamic Thinkers Society. Now, Khaled Hussein thought he was speaking to a fellow ally, someone who thought like him, who was a member of the ITS and who might support the wider ideology, when he admitted in voice recordings that were played out in court in Woolwich, where he said that the Islamic Thinkers Society was a branch of al-Muhajiroon. That was a core part of the prosecution's case. Now, Dominic Murphy, the Met's counter-terrorism command, said that this decision was a significant moment for British counter-terrorism.
We know that Anjem Chowdary's had involvement with individuals that have committed terrorist attacks here in the UK in the past, but also travelled overseas to join ISIS. So actually disrupting Anjem Choudary and, of course, his group, al-Muhajiroon, a proscribed organisation here under the Terrorism Act in the UK, will help us to manage public safety. But of course, you know, we need to keep a watchful eye on others that are involved in radicalisation. So our work won't stop here, but this is nonetheless a significant milestone.
OK, Charlie Peters, Anjem Choudary once called himself the #1 radicaliser in Britain. That was a badge of honour for me, a medallion on my chest. Well, that's a medallion he'll be able to wear in prison. He's sentenced a week today. Charlie Peters, thanks for joining us from outside New Scotland Yard. Thank you very much. Excellent. Moving on, the BBC has published its annual report today, revealing their biggest fat cat earners. No surprises, Gary Lineker is once again the broadcaster's best paid presenter, taking home a whopping £1.35 million of taxpayers, BBC licence payers' tax money each and every year. Hugh Edwards is also among the BBC's highest paid stars of the last year. The former newsreader's salary increased by £40,000 despite his suspension last July. Well, GBNews' reporter Anjem Choudary is outside London Broadcasting House. Adam, welcome to the show. No surprises that Gary Lineker tops the Premier League of earners, but a few eyebrows raised about Hugh Edwards. He didn't even work.
Yeah, that's right, Martin. It's a tale of two parts, really, in this report. So, as you say, Gary Lineker doing very well, £1.35 million again. It's the same as last year for him. Zoe Ball also taking in £900,000. Hugh Edwards getting a 40k pay rise, despite being off air since last July. Tim Davie, the Director General, held a press briefing before this report was published earlier today, and he was asked about this. And he said, look, given the circumstances, the BBC felt they had acted proportionately and appropriately, and that actually when a staff member, regardless of their salary, is suspended, they keep their full pay. In this case, it goes up, despite not being on television. Meanwhile, a lot of disgruntlement here outside Broadcasting House, because Tim Davie also confirmed that there will be 500 job cuts because the BBC is under such financial pressure. The licence fee, although it went up in April, doesn't go as far as it used to. In fact, they're now about £1 billion a year worse off than they were compared to 2010, 14 years ago. So roughly 30% less money in the coffers to pay all these top salaries. Not only that, but it's published amongst a cloud of scrutiny, with the Strictly Come Dancing scandal still unfolding, with celebrity contestants saying they were mistreated and that there needs to be some sort of investigation into this. Tim Davie apologised for that and said if there was any mistreatment, the BBC is sorry, but nonetheless the contest or the show will go ahead later this year as planned, albeit with chaperones for the top stars. Whether that will be enough, whether this will keep this out of the headlines, remains to be seen. But as I say, job cuts, financial pressure, but the top earners continue to do very, very well.
Anjem Choudary live from the BBC. The fat cats just got fatter. Thanks for joining us on the show. Now, we've got some breaking news for you now from the USA, and Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle has resigned today after the agency came under harsh scrutiny for its failure to stop a would-be assassin from attempting to kill former President Donald Trump during a campaign rally, according to media reports. If you recall, on the show yesterday, she was absolutely brutally cross-examined by Congress, and sure enough, the following day, she's resigned. Just to repeat that breaking news, if you're joining us now, US Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle has resigned after the agency came under harsh scrutiny for its abject failure to stop a would-be assassin from attempting to take the life of former President Donald Trump during a campaign rally on July the 13th. And that's according to media reports. So less than 24 hours after we showed that live on this screen, she has gone. It was a brutal cross-examination. Everybody watching that thought there was simply no way she could survive. And 24 hours on, that's the case. She's gone from her post. Now, still lots more to come between now and 4 o'clock. And just 19 days into the Labour government, and already public sector pay rises could set taxpayers back an eye-watering £14 billion every single year. Could Starmonomics cost you a packet?
Good afternoon. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, it's a fine evening out there. There are 1 or 2 showers around, but many places dry and fine with reasonably light winds. A few heavy showers across parts of eastern Scotland. 1 or 2 scattered showers for England and Wales, but they are very well scattered. Most places staying dry. Any showers fading away pretty sharply, so a dry night with decent clear spells. Quite a warm night across the south. Some towns and cities holding up at 15 or 16 degrees, a little cooler further north. Not much mist and fog, which means generally fine starts tomorrow. There will be some cloud here and there, but for many it'll be a day of good spells of sunshine. Like today, 1 or 2 showers likely to get going, particularly across parts of the east. And we are going to see the cloud increasing later across Northern Ireland. But still here for many, it's a dry and a fine start, as it will be across much of Scotland too. Temperatures soon starting to lift with the help of a little bit of sunshine. I suspect the Moray Firth could get into the low 20s by the afternoon. Now, as we go through the day, we will see a bit more of the cloud bubbling up over parts of eastern England, Lincolnshire, down to Cambridgeshire. Chance of 1 or 2 showers here. Could even be the odd heavy one, but most areas staying dry. The main exception to that will be Northern Ireland, where cloud and rain will trickle in by lunchtime. And the west coast of Wales, likely to see some showery rain by the end of the afternoon. Same goes for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. But elsewhere, generally, we'll hang on to some spells of sunshine. Warmer than today as well, 25, 26, maybe 27 in London. It'll be cooler further west with a thicker cloud and the rain. That will pep up a little during the evening time. Some heavier bursts getting into western Scotland. That moves towards Shetland for the start of Thursday. And on Thursday, across the south, there will be some more wet weather coming in. Could be some heavy bursts of rain mixed in with this. Some heavy showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. In between, something a little bit drier. And generally, temperatures just dipping off a little bit by Thursday, back into the high teens or low 20s.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. Slow traffic on the M60 anti-clockwise at junction 15, the Swinton interchange. Long delays on the M42 southbound in Warwickshire. There's a lane closed for an overturned vehicle between junction 7 Coleshill and 6 for Birmingham Airport. There's also been an overturned vehicle involved in an accident on the M1 northbound in Bedfordshire. That's just after junction 10, the Luton Airport Spur Road. Queues going back towards junction 9 for Redburn. We're seeing some slow traffic into London on the M4 into the elevated section at junction 3 Hayes. It's also slow for the M25 into the roadworks in Surrey just before junction 10 the Wisley interchange, and we're seeing slow traffic now on the M25 QE2 bridge clockwise up towards junction 1A for Dartford. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Welcome back. Your time is 3:42. I'm Martin Daubney, and this is GB News. Now, it's just 19 days into a new government, and economists have warned that Labour's inflation-busting public sector pay rises could cost an eye-watering £10 billion every year, and with scrapping the two-child limit, an extra 2.4 billion quid every single year. All of this could add up to an extra spending of £70 billion over the course of the Labour Parliament. And today's big question is, are bumper tax hikes on the way? Could Starmer-nomics cost you a packet? Well, I can discuss this now in our studio with GB News' political correspondent, Catherine Forster. So, Catherine, without a shot being fired by the unions, there's been no strikes. Public sector pay rises are being offered up by the Labour Party straight away. And when you do the numbers, it's a bumper giveaway. There's only one way of paying for all this, surely. Tax rises.
Well, they haven't said that they're going to accept the recommendations of the pay review bodies yet, although there have been noises that clearly they're very concerned about retention and recruitment in teaching, in the NHS, etc. But, you know, this 5.5% for teachers, that's way above what they were expecting, way above what they've budgeted for. Inflation, of course, at just 2%. So if they do decide to honour those recommendations, yes, it's going to be very expensive. And we know already that they're massively constrained because, frankly, there is no money left. I mean, the government has gone on a series of huge spending sprees, COVID, war in Europe, etc., etc. So the government that came in knew that it was going to be difficult. They have been very keen to highlight just how awful their inheritance is. But, you know, they said no planned tax rises, borrowing within very strict guidelines, etc., etc. Something is going to have to give. And, of course, there are, you know, while saying they weren't going to put up VAT or income tax, etc., there are various tax rises that they could put up, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, etc., or they break some of the fiscal rules that they have put in place. They've basically accepted the Conservative sort of very tight spending plans. But just worth saying that the Conservative spending plans, they deliberately pushed a lot of these very tough decisions into the next Parliament. And also there's the sort of elephant trap being laid for Labour by the fact that Rishi Sunak cut national insurance twice, which was very, very expensive.
All this stuff doesn't come for free. Catherine Forster, thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure. Now, moving on. New research has suggested that the new government should integrate health services and job centres to get more people into work. The report says that in order to unlock a hidden workforce of 3 million people who are economically inactive, personalised help must be offered based on health, and local NHS care boards should work alongside regional mayors to help people back into work in their local areas. Well, let's get the thoughts now of the former Health Secretary, Alan Milburn. Alan, welcome to the show. This sounds like a good notion. Join up services, points of contact with people going to get health care. They can also be accessed in terms of trying to get them back into work. We know we've got a massive problem with economic inactivity and benefits bills. Tell us, how would it work?
We have got a big problem. In fact, it's a remarkable thing, really, that in our country today, the biggest constraint on growing the British economy is shortages of labour. You know, I come from an era when I was growing up in the northeast of England of mass unemployment. I'm speaking from Barnsley today, which was the epicentre of mass unemployment when the pits closed in the 1980s. Today, it's got lower than average unemployment, but it has this massive problem of worklessness, people who are being classified as unable to work, largely on ill health grounds. And if we're going to be able to fuel growth in the British economy, then we've got to get more of those people back into work, because otherwise you rely on more and more immigration, and as we know, that has become more and more politically toxic as an issue. So joining up these services, ensuring that the health service, healthcare and employment services are working together, is the best way of making sure that these people who would like to have a job can actually get one.
You know, welfare is the second biggest of all of our outgoings after the NHS, of course. Benefits, unemployment benefits are a huge part of that, Mr. Milburn. Will there be a bit of stick in this, or will it be carrot? For example, if you go along and it's proven that you're able to work and you're not working, might the Labour Party start withholding benefits and try and save a few quid for the taxpayer?
Well, I'm not speaking today on behalf of the Labour Party because I'm chairing an independent Pathways to Work Commission. But I think, look, if people are gaming the system, and in particular if there are people who could work and aren't working, then clearly the taxpayer shouldn't be paying for the pleasure. That's something that has got to be dealt with. But the really interesting thing is, when we've polled people, surveyed people here in South Yorkshire, asking people who are being categorised, remember, as unable to work, how many of them would really like a job? 7 in 10 say that they would. But here's the rub. 8 in 10 of those people get a state benefit, some welfare payments, but only 1 in 10 have any contact from the employment support services. So in our report today, we say there should be a new two-way street, that employment support services should have to engage with those people to try to help them back into work, but equally, there should be an obligation on the part of those people to engage with those services in order that they can do what they want to do, which is to get back into work. That's good for them, it's good for the local economy, and as you rightly say, it's good too because it caps the welfare bill that keeps rising.
OK, we have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, former Health Secretary Alan Milburn. Thank you very much. Now, coming up, we'll be discussing the US Secret Service chief who has now stood down following the Trump rally shooting. Dramatic stuff. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
An employment tribunal has found that a senior lawyer telling a legal secretary that she looked nice created an intimidating environment and made her feel violated.
Well, she's won her sexual harassment suit, so is saying someone looks nice acceptable in the workplace anymore?
Well, joining us now to debate this is political commentator Christine Hamilton, who thinks it should be, and author and journalist Rebecca Reid, who thinks making comments like these are unnecessary. OK, Rebecca, why is it unnecessary to tell your colleague they look nice?
Well, how somebody looks at work shouldn't be particularly important or relevant, but I think my issue here is that it's used as a sort of dismissive way to make women feel silly for complaining about things. Like, oh, it's just saying you look nice, why does it matter? But we all know there are different ways of saying things, and if you are an older man in a position of power, looking a woman up and down and saying, oh, you look nice, in a lascivious tone, which, as far as we know, is quite possibly what happened, that's not acceptable, that's not workplace appropriate, and it would make somebody feel uncomfortable.
Christine, she's right, Rebecca, isn't she? It depends how it's said. If you've got someone who's sleazy saying, oh, you look nice, you're going to be a bit off-put, aren't you?
Yes, we don't know whether this was said in a lascivious tone or not, and as far as I can see this particular case, the boss went too far and he did a lot of other things as well. But what worries me is that the tribunal has ruled that just saying you look nice could be included as sexual harassment. Now, I think that is ridiculous.
Realistically, women don't make these accusations for fun. Women don't make these accusations to be difficult. They do it because they've been made to feel unsafe or unable to work in a certain place.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
I'm Andrew Pearce. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tomorrow from 6, the legends of breakfast television are back together. Eamon Holmes and Anne Diamond. only on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 3:52. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, in the last half an hour, the director of the US Secret Service has resigned from her post after the agency was heavily criticised following the assassination attempt on Donald Trump on July the 13th. Kimberly Cheetle was subjected to a brutal cross-examination yesterday, around about 24 hours ago, before a House committee, during which she was accused of cutting corners on the former president's security and was told she would have been culpable if Donald Trump had been killed. Well, I'm now joined by GB News' reporter Ray Addison. Ray, we carried this cross-examination on the show yesterday. It was absolutely eviscerating, savage. Miss Cheetle didn't seem to have any answers to the big questions. And lo and behold, she was said at the time, one of the senators said, Joe Biden needs to fire you. That didn't happen. She's resigned. Tell us more.
Well, yeah, not only did she not have any answers, but it seemed that she had not done the necessary investigation into this incident that the whole of the world and certainly America would have expected. She didn't have any answers about the what officials knew about the potential threats there, the decisions that they had made, anything about the suspicious behaviour of the suspect and who knew what at what times. But she had denied claims which have been repeated by many Republicans that the Secret Service had refused additional resources to protect Donald Trump at that event, and said that they did have the resources that they had requested at that particular event in Pennsylvania. And so she had initially refused to resign, despite calling that incident on July 13th the most significant operational failure at the Secret Service in decades. But the pressure has just been too much now for Cheetle. It's not just come from the Republican Party, it's come from the Democrats as well. And that just overwhelming amount of people just calling on her to step down has obviously resulted in this.
Some of the questions in there, Ray Addison, yesterday were simply astonishing. They were the most basic questions you would expect a director of the Secret Service to know the answer to, and she simply didn't have them. The most incredible question, the entire audience gasped, Ray, when this was asked, and she answered. The question was, why was the president allowed to take to the stage when you knew a suspicious man was on the roof? To which she replied, we didn't know he was dangerous. At that point, Ray Addison, the writing was on the wall. She had to go.
And it's fascinating because, you know, we've seen so many reports now that they knew about the presence of crooks up to 60 minutes before any shots rang out. But she was unable to answer, you know, what action had been taken. She was unable, as you said, to answer basic questions such as how many Secret Service officers were there, how many police officers were there, and certainly the idea of failing to guard this perimeter, this building that was deemed to be outside of the perimeter, and yet only around 125 to 150 metres away from where the Republicans' presidential candidate was speaking, a former president, no less, was speaking, has just beggared belief and shocked the American public. And it's bizarre because, you know, she has served in the Secret Service for around 20 years. She left and worked for PepsiCo, and then she came back. She was appointed by President Biden as the head of the Secret Service. She had guarded him and his wife, Dr. Jill, when he was vice president. And so she, you know, she certainly should have had the experience and the knowledge to know how many guards were needed, and that the buildings such as that rooftop, just a mere metres away from where Donald Trump was speaking, should have been secured.
OK, astonishing stuff, Ray Addison. Thank you very much. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll have much more reaction to this story and also the Bibi Stockholm barge being scrapped by the government. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. Queues on the M1 northbound in West Yorkshire. There's a lane closed for an earlier car fire between junction 44 Leeds South and 45 Leeds Cross Green. Queue in traffic on the M61 northbound in Manchester. There's a lane closed there for a vehicle having a tyre change. That's between junction 4 Farnworth and 5 for West Horton. Queues on the M1 northbound in Bedfordshire due to an earlier accident involving an overturned vehicle just after junction 10, the Luton Airport Spur Road. Queues going back towards junction 9 Redburn. Delays on the M26 eastbound in Kent. There's a lane closed for emergency barrier repairs between junction 2A for Rougham and 3 for the M20. And in Surrey, there's slow traffic on the M25 into the roadworks anti-clockwise just before junction 10, the Wisley interchange. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Don't miss your chance to win our Super Summer Giveaway. With your chance to win £30,000 cash, our biggest cash prize to date. Which means you get to spend every single penny however you like. What plans would you make with an extra £30,000 cash in your bank account? Take your family on the ultimate holiday, buy that treat that's always seemed out of reach, or just put it in the bank for a later date. However you'd spend it, make sure you don't miss out. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrants must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQs live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQs live here on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Tomorrow from 6, the legends of breakfast television are back together. Eamon Holmes and Anne Diamond, only on GB News.
A very good afternoon to you. It's 4 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show. We're on GB News, broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK. On today's show, after scrapping the Rwanda bill on day one, today Labour has dramatically axed the Bibi Stockholm barge. Our asylum seeker camps at RAF Scampton and RAF Wethersfield next to be scrapped, but with no signs of illegal immigration coming down anytime soon. Where will they all be housed? Are they coming to a street near you soon? Next up, Islamist hate preacher Anjem Choudary is facing life in jail after being found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. Choudary, who once boasted he was the #1 radicaliser in Britain, will be sentenced a week today. And the BBC has published its annual Fat Cat salary list, and no surprises, once again, Gary Lineker is the top of the table on £1.35 million a year. But Hugh Edwards, who didn't even work last year due to suspension, well, he trousered a 40 grand pay rise. Is it time to scrap the BBC licence fee? And that's all coming up in your next hour. Well, the show, always a delight to have your company. And a short while ago, we announced on the show that Kimberly Cheetle, the US Secret Service Director, has dramatically resigned just 24 hours after we carried that brutal cross-examination on yesterday's show. She didn't have any answers to the questions about how President-elect Trump was almost assassinated millimetres from death. She had simply no responses to the questions. Now she's gone 24 hours later. We'll have the full reaction, of course, to that throughout the show. Get in touch, usual ways, gbnews.com/You'll Save It. Now, your headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Martin, thank you, and good afternoon to you. Well, first, let's bring you a little bit more on that breaking news you were just hearing about. The head of the US Secret Service, within the last 20 minutes or so, resigning amid intense criticism of her handling of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. We saw yesterday that she spoke to a congressional committee and she admitted that the attempt on Mr. Trump's life was, in her words, the most significant operational US Secret Service failure for decades. She'd been testifying before that House committee in an effort to explain her actions. She did take full responsibility for what went wrong and has today fallen on her sword. She has resigned from the US Secret Service. Meanwhile, attention is turning to who Vice President Kamala Harris may pick as her running mate, as she asserts herself as the presumed nominee for the Democrats to face Donald Trump. On her first full day in the race, many of those once tipped to challenge the Vice President instead threw their support right behind her. That paved the way for her campaign to raise around $81 million in just 24 hours yesterday, and that just a day after President Biden dropped out of the race. And it all comes as party members and supporters commend Mr. Biden's decision, including the actor George Clooney, who raised a significant amount of money for the Democratic campaign. Now, here in the UK, the government's going to shut down a barge used to house migrants off the south coast of England as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. The use of the Bibby Stockholm, which can house around 500 men, began under the Conservative government. But human rights campaigners compared it to a prison ship and criticised its use as inhumane. Extending the use of the Bibby Stockholm would have cost more than £20 million next year. Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty today of directing a terrorist organisation. His trial found he directed the group known as Al-Muhajirun for a significant period starting in 2014 and had also encouraged support at online meetings of Islamist thinkers. Dominic Murphy is head of counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police. He says today's verdict marks an important moment.
We know that Anjem Choudhary's had involvement with individuals that have committed terrorist attacks here in the UK in the past, but also travelled overseas to join ISIS. So actually disrupting Anjem Choudary and, of course, his group Al-Muhajirun, a prescribed organisation here under the Terrorism Act in the UK, will help us to manage public safety. But of course, you know, we need to keep a watchful eye on others that are involved in radicalisation. So our work won't stop here, but this is nonetheless a significant milestone.
There's been a stabbing at a prison and a police officer has received a stab wound. The officer, we understand, is conscious and talking and has been taken to hospital following that incident, which happened this morning at Frankland Prison. That's near Durham, and that statement, according to the local constabulary, he was visiting the Category A men's prison from an outside force, we're told. Water companies will be expected to do far more to protect the health of Britain's waterways when new powers are given to the regulator. The Environment Secretary says a promised crackdown on water firms will include tougher fines for polluting, ensuring money is properly invested into infrastructure rather than paid out in bonuses. The Environment Agency reported 47 serious pollution incidents last year. That's up from 44 in 2022. Steve Reed says that's unacceptable.
It would cost hundreds of billions of pounds to nationalise the water companies, and it would take years to unravel the current ownership models. I want to crack on and clean up the water as fast as we can. That is best done by giving the regulator the power, the teeth they need to stop these practices, and that includes the powers to make water bosses responsible for illegal pollution face criminal charges for the law breaking for which they are responsible.
Police investigating disturbances in the Hare Hills area of Leeds last week say they've now made a total of 20 arrests. The riots that ensued are believed to be linked to a case involving local children who were taken into care by social services. Vehicles could be seen on fire and a police car was overturned. West Yorkshire Police saying the fast-paced investigation continues. They've identified, they say, 40 suspects. And just lastly, may I tell you about one of the world's greatest tennis champions who's saying au revoir after the Paris Olympics. Andy Murray has announced that this year's Games will be his last ever tennis tournament. He was recently denied a Wimbledon farewell in the singles after he had surgery on his spine just a week before the tournament. But in a post on social media, he said that competing for Team GB has been by far the most memorable weeks of his career, and he's proud to do it one final time. Scotland's First Minister John Swinney hailed Murray as our greatest ever sportsman. And those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I'm back in half an hour with more. See you then.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Polly. Now we begin with the huge news that the government will end the use of the Bibby Stockholm barge for housing migrants off England's south coast as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. And the contract for the barge, moored in Dorset, will not be renewed past January, as demand for such accommodation will be reduced by moves to clear the asylum backlog, as announced by the Home Office yesterday. The vessel was one of several sites, including the military bases RAF Wethersfield in Essex and also RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, used by the previous Tory government in a bid to cut the cost of housing migrants in hotels. I'm now joined by our Homeland Security editor, Mark White. Mark, this, I think, is a clear indication of where this government is going. Rwanda, scrapped on day one. Bibby Stockholm, now scrapped. Scampton, Wethersfield, huge question marks over them. Hotels, we know they're opposed to them. Mark White, my simple question is, if none of the above solutions are going to suffice, where on earth will these asylum seekers be going?
Yeah, I think it's a very big development, the decision to end use of the Bibby Stockholm come January next year. And it is a big development for the simple reason that it does give that clear indication of the direction of travel in policy terms for dealing with the asylum backlog in this country. Now, the Rwanda deal is separate to that. That is, of course, an issue around trying to stop the small boats crossing. That deterrent the Tory government thought was the way forward. This government believes will not be a deterrent, it's just a gimmick. But the other big issue is how you deal with the asylum backlog, the many thousands of asylum seekers who are languishing in hotels or indeed on the Bibby Stockholm or at the former Wethersfield base in Essex. Going forward, it seems clear the government now, their stated intention is to end the use of these hotels. The first step now is the end of the use of the Bibby Stockholm. They will want to return hotels back to local use, and that will be widely welcomed by hundreds of communities right across the country who have been very opposed to that asset, that valuable asset of a hotel being taken out of commission and used for asylum seekers with all of the knock-on effects that has, not available for weddings, functions, for business people and tourists coming into your area, and also, of course, asylum seekers, young men mainly, hanging about in their hundreds outside that hotel and in the local community. But the flip side of that, Martin, is that you still have to accommodate them somewhere. Now, if you are rapidly going through the assessment period to ensure that all of the asylum backlog is dealt with, you're either granting them asylum or you're not. If you're not granting them asylum, you've got to remove them from the country. You can't do that if they're coming from a country that you can't remove them to, like Iran or Iraq or Syria and Afghanistan. We've talked about this many times before. What do you do then? Well, they're given indefinite leave to remain here. Effectively, they're granted asylum. And in doing that, these people will be housed in local authority areas instead. So no longer under the control of the Home Office and these hotel accommodations or the bigger bases, but instead local authorities will have to find room for them in areas right across the country. And that means the likes of social housing becoming increasingly scarce for local inhabitants in those communities.
And Mark White, Angela Rayner said on the 26th of June, every part of Britain will have to take its fair share of migrants. It now looks like that's the case. If containment centres in different countries have been scotched, if barges offshore have been scotched, if containment centres on RAF sites have been scotched. Mark, the only answer is either to build houses, well, there aren't enough houses for Brits to live in, or to buy cheap housing via Serco. This could be Serco on steroids. We know at the moment, Mark White, there's a 62% asylum rate being granted. This won't deter the human traffickers at all, will it?
Well, it will be very interesting to see going forward exactly how local authorities are going to be able to accommodate these people, because they said quite clearly, local authorities right up and down the country under the Conservative government, there was just no room. The Conservative government incentivised them by making some more money available, but if there's no room, there's no room, unless you embark on a social housing, council housing building programme, as you suggested there. So it will be, as I say, very interesting to see going forward just what they do to absorb these people into communities who already feel that the services that they have, including the ability to get into social housing, have been severely restricted. That will only, I think, add to the tensions that many of these communities feel at the moment. And that other point that you mentioned there about whether this becomes a pull factor is a real concern for those who are very concerned about this being the stated policy of the new Labour government, because they say that going forward, if you're a people smuggler and you're trying to get people to embark on that dangerous journey across the channel and give you thousands of pounds to boot, then your argument is far stronger if you can say to those would-be asylum seekers that go under Labour now, you'll get your asylum claim dealt with much more quickly, and the chances are that you're going to be allowed to stay in the UK, and to boot, you will very quickly be moved into social housing somewhere in the country.
Mark White, I think you're right. I fear you're right. An excellent summary, as ever. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. Now, moving on, the Tory leadership race has now officially begun as Rishi Sunak formally stood down as leader of the Conservative Party. Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly has strongly indicated that he will throw his hat into the ring, whilst Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, Tom Tugendhat, Priti Patel and Robert Jenrick are also expected to be some of the runners and riders for the top job. And there will also be internal debates within the Conservatives on the direction they should take going forward, with the party losing votes to Labour, Reform UK and the Lib Dems at the last general election. Let's now speak with GB News' political correspondent Catherine Fawcett. I'm also joined by the Conservative MP for Wetherby and Easingwold. Welcome to the show, the pair of you. Let's start with you, Catherine. So, November, for starters, is a long time away. A lot of people felt that Rishi Sunak might do a David Cameron and fall on his sword the following day. That isn't the case. What's the logic in having such a protracted leadership bid?
Yeah, it's a very long time, isn't it? And as always within the Conservative Party, not everybody is happy about this. Some people think that it's very self-indulgent and there'll be lots of sort of public infighting, etc., etc. But more broadly, many of them feel that they need to take the time to take stock properly about what has gone wrong and how they can rebuild and what sort of party they need to be going forward. And the thinking is, get whoever wants to put themselves forward now. They'll need 10 MPs, have lots of events over the summer, get it down to 4 at the beginning of September. Those 4 go off to conference, have like a beauty parade, if you like. Then MPs will whittle that down to 2. And then at that point, the members get the final say, as of course they did with Liz Truss. Worth pointing out, of course, that the Conservative Party membership is traditionally to the right of where many of the MPs are. I think a lot of the MPs will want some sort of unity candidate that can appeal to people who've gone to the Lib Dems, because done very well, haven't they? And well, there'll be others that think they need to appeal to reform voters. So I think it's going to be tricky. I'll be interested to see what Alec has to say.
Alec Sherbrooke, let's bring you in at this point. So the runners and the riders, the bookies' favourite at the moment, anyhow, is Kemi Badenoch at 6-4, Robert Jenrick in second at 4-1, Tom Tugendhat, more of a centrist proposition, 5-1, Priti Patel 6-1, James Cleverly 7-1, and then Suella Braverman now being pushed out quite severely, 14-1. The party has got a lot of problems, being squeezed from the right by Reform UK, being squeezed from the left by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. First of all, what do you think, before we talk about the leader, what do you think the direction of the Conservative Party should be, Alec?
Well, it's got to be pragmatic. The Conservative Party has always been at its strongest when it's been pragmatic. It's got to get away from the silos, if you will, of the different, I think they were called the families at one point, the different groupings. It's got to be a Conservative Party. It's got to get back to small state, low taxes, governing for everybody, making sure that the middle-aged middle class want to vote for the Conservative Party. These are all things that have drifted away, not through any sudden moment, but they've drifted away. That's the reset we've got to be looking for. That's the pragmatism we've got to be looking for. And it's about recognising that we are the Conservative Party. We're not trying to be economically like Labour or perhaps international or socially like Reform, or take some of the liberally Lib Dem route. It's got to be something that appeals to the country, appeals to the people who shift their vote considerably over a period of time. I don't know what the issues are going to be in 4 years' time, but it's important that we have a leader who has the pragmatism and the wherewithal to be able to look at those issues when they come. I've had set up the operation behind that as we get there.
So my next question, Alec Sherbrooke, is blooming obvious. Who do you think should lead the party? Bear in mind, you're laying out a role for good old-fashioned Conservative.
Yep, and my opinion on that has been for a long time. I can give the exclusive here and now, because nobody else knows, but my opinion's been for a long time, and I will be nominating Priti Patel.
OK, why?
Well, because, as I said, I think Priti has not just the pragmatic approach to all the issues I've just laid out, but she was also there, brought into CCHQ by Cecil Parkinson in 1997, about how to rebuild the Conservative Party after that defeat. You get this pattern in governments that after a long period of time in government, the structure starts to fall down. You think it would do the opposite, but it doesn't. You're so busy on governing, the structure falls down. That's task number one. But as I say, it's about, most important thing, being pragmatic. Look, Priti has had senior roles. She's respected on all wings of the party, and I think that's an important point. And it comes back to, we've got to have a Conservative leader representing the Conservative Party and get away from these different gangs that have formed and have been fighting with each other. The enemy's not within the Conservative Party. The enemy is the 174 Labour majority sitting opposite, who there's going to be a lot of people who didn't vote for us are starting to think, wow, this is not the direction I wanted my country to go in.
Catherine.
We hear a lot, don't we, that lots of Conservative voters sat at home or voted for reform because you weren't Conservative enough. But, of course, Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt would have said that they were fiscal Conservatives naturally, but that events, dear boy, intervened first with, the pandemic and the fact that furlough, and then with war in Europe. So we ended up with a bigger state and higher taxes. But how much of that really is the Conservative Party's fault? Because didn't they just have the misfortune to be in government at that point?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said in that, because I think if you look at Western governments around the world, most of them then went on to lose the next election. And I think COVID has a very long tail to it. But there is a world of difference between, we did raise taxes and the size of the state is expanded normally, and that has to change. But if we look at the government we've now got, they actually want to take that further just as a matter of policy. And that's what a Conservative Party, trying to become a Conservative government, has to clearly outline, that big state and big taxes are not the way that you're going to prosper as a country. The country, as Margaret Thatcher said, it was the small shopkeeper syndrome. It was the small business syndrome. Balance the books, know what you're spending, know where it comes in. Profligate spending having to raise taxes more and more, especially with an ageing population and that tax base decreasing and the costs going up. There is a balance to be had. You've got to grow your economy. Now, Labour talk about that sort of time. Well, we're going to grow the economy, not put taxes up. Let's see how much that holds out in September.
Well, there's a long way to go. Alex Yarbrough, thank you very much for making a pitch today for your choice. Priti Patel, Catherine Forster, of course, always a pleasure. Thanks to you both. Now, moving on the way, we'll discuss the BBC report, which shows that Hugh Edwards has the BBC's third highest paid presenter last year with a 40 grand pay rise, despite not working for 9 months due to suspension. You couldn't make it up. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled.
Lovely. Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Now, we've got a story and a half to tell you and bring you now. Our very own GB News political correspondent, who we love very much, Catherine Foster, joins us in the studio, and she's smiling, but she wasn't smiling for the past few days.
2 of her sons, Matthew and Andrew, were reported missing in Bali.
I got a text from a friend saying, can you give us a call, a bit worried about them. Then spoke to a girl they'd befriended who was in Sweden, but they'd met on their travels. And she told me that they'd gone up the mountain. By the time I found out, they'd been missing for 30 hours. They'd gone up the mountain on the Tuesday night, British time. This was the Thursday morning, without a guide. And they'd told her it was really hard. And she told them to turn back, but they hadn't. And they'd sent screenshots from this app with this trail that they were following on the app, screenshots of the app in case there was a problem, and a Snapchat of a Matthew avatar at the top. And she said, I know they made it to the top because I could see that his phone had nearly died. But the trail had actually closed many years ago. So the app, we will need to make sure that that gets taken off the app. But, you know, technology saved them in the end because it was the screenshots and it was the messages that they'd sent, but they should never have been without a guide.
But what were you doing during those 30 hours that Mum couldn't, when the phone died and Mum couldn't get in touch? Where were you? What were you up to?
Well, we were trying to figure out the best course of action, because it started to pour with rain. The amount of rain created a river, like a stream.
Yeah.
We were like, well, let's follow the stream downhill, and then the sun set, and we just had to like sleep in the bushes in the jungle.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. This is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tomorrow from 6, the legends of breakfast television are back together. Eamon Holmes and Anne Diamond, only on GB News.
Welcome back. Your time is 4:26. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, the BBC has published its annual report today, revealing their biggest fat cat earners. No surprises, Gary Lineker is once again the broadcaster's best paid presenter, taking home a whopping 1.35 million quid every year. Hugh Edwards is also among the BBC's highest paid stars of the last year. The former newsreader's salary increased by £40,000, despite not working for 9 months after a suspension last July. Well, GB News' reporter Anjem Choudary is outside London Broadcasting House. Adam, welcome to the show. As I said, no surprises that old Big Ears is top of the pile, but Hugh Edwards, he hasn't lifted a finger on that suspension. What on earth's going on?
Well, that's right, Martin. Hugh Edwards suspended over a year ago now. He hasn't been on screen since last July, yet he nonetheless picks up a £40,000 pay rise in this annual report. Now, this is his last time he'll appear in these reports because he resigned entirely in April. But nonetheless, fine work if you can get it, for the top earners at least. Elsewhere, there's serious pressure on the BBC, serious financial pressure, as this report details. Tim Davie admitting today that they now have 30% less cash in the coffers compared to 2010. The licence fee just doesn't stretch as far as it used to. In fact, they're £1 billion a year worse off. And the report also shows that 500,000 households have removed their licence fee in the last year. So trouble in paradise here, not just because of the financial pressure, but also because of the Strictly Come Dancing scandal, which is continuing to unfold. Some top celebrity stars of that contest in previous years saying they were essentially mistreated and bullied by their professional dance partners. And Tim Davie today in the press briefing apologised for that and said if there was any mistreatment, he's very sorry, but nonetheless the contest will continue this year because it's just so popular. There will be chaperones, so it'll be a slightly more sanitised affair, but it will nonetheless go ahead. As I say, the top stars do very well. Gary Lineker, 1.35 million, Zoe Ball on 900,000, but 500 staff members facing the chop by March 2026 because they're under such significant pressure without that licence fee cash flowing in so readily.
And Adam, there's a constant conversation whenever this list comes out. It's an annual list where we all foam at the mouth slightly about how much these levies are paid, and then we always roll onto the conversation about the BBC licence fee. Is it outmoded? Is it time for a rethink? Can I ask you, Anjem Choudary, do you think politically the BBC is safer in terms of a review of that licence now the Labour Party is in power?
Yeah, well, in the last week, Keir Starmer has assured that the BBC licence fee is here to stay, and they have an interest in protecting it. So for now, at least, yes, it will continue. And the BBC recently raised the cost of the licence fee to £169, which is roughly a £10 increase since last year. So it will continue chugging along. They're going to have to streamline. They're going to have to shed some jobs and make some changes. It doesn't seem to be that the people at the top will be feeling the pressure so much as those a little bit further down. So for now they're safe, but the reality is young people just aren't as interested in the output, and you can see that in the report as well. Less than 70% of young people saying they have an interest in the BBC because they just can't compete with the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime and so on that offer more compelling television with higher budgets without having to worry about licence fee cash flowing in.
Anjem Choudary, thank you. Excellent summary as ever. A lot of people watching this, we're thinking, put it to the market. Let the market decide. That's a debate for another time. Thank you very much, Adam. Always a pleasure. Now, there's loads more still to come between now and 5 o'clock after scrapping the Rwanda bill on day one. Today, the Labour Party has dramatically axed the Bibi Stockholm barge. But just where will the asylum seekers go? Perhaps they're coming to a street near you soon. First is your headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
The headlines this hour from the GB newsroom. The Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. His trial found that he directed the Al-Mujahiroon group for a significant period of time, starting in 2014, and had also encouraged support for it by addressing online meetings of the Islamic Thinkers Society. That's an Islamist group based in New York. The government's to shut down a barge used for housing migrants off the south coast of England as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. Use of the Bibi Stockholm barge, which can house up to 500, began under the Conservative government. Human rights campaigners have compared it to a floating prison and have criticised it as inhumane. A police officer has been stabbed at a prison near Durham. The officer is conscious and talking and in hospital following the incident, which happened this morning at Frankland Prison, according to Durham Police. Within the last 10 minutes, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has condemned what she's heard and said she's appalled over the incident. Her thoughts are with the officer and his family. And Charlotte Dujardin has withdrawn from the Olympics over a video from 4 years ago showing her making what she called an error of judgment during a dressage coaching session with her horse. The three-time Olympic champion said it's out of character and doesn't reflect how she trains her horses or coaches her pupils normally. She said she is sincerely sorry for her actions and is devastated to have let people down. And in the States, Kamala Harris is making quick moves to assert herself as the presumed nominee to face Donald Trump. On her first full day in the Democratic race, many of those once tipped to challenge the vice president have thrown their support behind her. And that's paved the way for her campaign to raise around $80 million in just 24 hours. That happening just a day after President Biden dropped out of that race. And all that comes as Joe Biden prepares to make an address from the Oval Office tomorrow to explain his plans for finishing the job, as he puts it. Those are the latest news headlines for now. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I've got more in half an hour. See you then.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Polly. Now, if you want to get in touch with us here at GB News, simply go to gbnews.com/your say, and I'll read out the best of your messages a little later in the show. I want to know, what do you think the Labour Party is going to do with all these asylum seekers? They're not going into the Bibi Stockholm. They're not going to Rwanda. They're not going up to RAF sites. So where do you think they will end up? I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, it's a fine evening out there. There are one or two showers around, but many places dry and fine with reasonably light winds. A few heavy showers across parts of eastern Scotland. One or two scattered showers for England and Wales, but they are very well scattered. Most places staying dry. Any showers fading away pretty sharply, so a dry night with decent clear spells. Quite a warm night across the south. Some towns and cities holding up at 15 or 16 degrees, a little cooler further north. Not much mist and fog, which means generally fine starts tomorrow. There will be some cloud here and there, but for many it'll be a day of good spells of sunshine. Like today, one or two showers likely to get going, particularly across parts of the east. And we are going to see the cloud increasing later across Northern Ireland. But still here for many, it's a dry and a fine start, as it will be across much of Scotland too. Temperatures soon starting to lift with the help of a little bit of sunshine. I suspect the Moray Firth could get into the low 20s by the afternoon. Now, as we go through the day, we will see a bit more of the cloud bubbling up over parts of eastern England, Lincolnshire, down to Cambridgeshire. Chance of one or two showers here. Could even be the odd heavy one, but most areas staying dry. The main exception to that will be Northern Ireland, where cloud and rain will trickle in by lunchtime. And the west coast of Wales, likely to see some showery rain by the end of the afternoon. Same goes for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. But elsewhere, generally, we'll hang on to some spells of sunshine. Warmer than today as well, 25, 26, maybe 27 in London. It'll be cooler further west with a thicker cloud and the rain. That will pep up a little during the evening time. Some heavier bursts getting into western Scotland. That moves towards Shetland for the start of Thursday. And on Thursday, across the south, there will be some more wet weather coming in. Could be some heavy bursts of rain mixed in with this. Some heavy showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. In between, something a little bit drier. And generally, temperatures just dipping off a little bit by Thursday, back into the high teens or low 20s.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. We've got the usual queues in Perth and Kinross on the M19 northbound at the Broxton roundabout. Slow for the Edinburgh City bypass, the A720 eastbound at the Sheriff Hall roundabout. The usual queues for the M5 northbound in the West Midlands to join the M6 at Junction 8. Congestion on the M5 in Somerset due to an earlier accident at Junction 22 Burnham-on-Sea. In Hampshire, we're seeing queues on the A34 southbound near Winchester. There's a lane closed for a broken down vehicle near the Winnell roundabout. We're seeing slow traffic on the M25 clockwise in Berkshire just before junction 15. That's the intersection with the M4. And queues on the M26 eastbound in Kent. There's a lane closed for emergency barrier repairs between junction 2A for Rootham and 3 for the M20. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Welcome back. It's 4:36. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Notorious Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation and encouraging support for it through online meetings. Following a trial at Woolwich Crown Court, Choudary was convicted of taking a caretaker role in directing the terror group. And let's get the latest now with GB News national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, justice has been a long time coming for Anjem Choudary, but it seems today he finally ran out of time. Tell us more.
Justice, a long time coming, but also this has been a significant objective from the UK intelligence and counter-terrorism community for decades, because al-Muhajiroon and Anjem Choudary have been key radicalisers in recent years. And this charge now, the successful conviction on Section 56 of the Terrorism Act, which is for directing a terrorist organisation, is extremely rare. Last handed down in 2008 for a mastermind of Al-Qaeda. But Anjem Choudary receiving that conviction alongside two others, not only for being a member of al-Muhajiroon, but also for encouraging support for it. Now, in the course of this trial, we also saw him sit alongside his co-defendant Khalid Hussein, who was also on charge for being a member of al-Muhajiroon. He was a Canadian national, and his involvement is really key to understanding how the Met and the Crown Prosecution Service achieved these convictions, because Khalid Hussein, the court heard, acted essentially as Anjem Chowdary's personal assistant, organising meetings of a group called the Islamic Thinkers Society, an American organisation which had a significant gathering in New York, and undercover officers from the New York Police Department and from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police infiltrated the organisation and established that Anjem Choudary was giving lectures to the Islamic Thinkers Society on encrypted platforms, lectures that he started giving after his licence conditions expired following a previous conviction for supporting the Islamic State terrorist organisation. The prosecution were seeking to establish that al-Muhajiroon was the Islamic State, the Islamic Thinkers Society, that those two groups were together. They achieved that with those three convictions today, and in reaction, Dominic Murphy, commander of the Met's Counter-Terrorism Command, gave his view on this historic conviction.
We know that Anjem Chowdary's had involvement with individuals that have committed terrorist attacks here in the UK in the past, but also travelled overseas to join ISIS. So actually disrupting Anjem Choudary and, of course, his group, al-Muhajiroon, a prescribed organisation here under the Terrorism Act in the UK, will help us to manage public safety. But of course, you know, we need to keep a watchful eye on others that are involved in radicalisation. So our work won't stop here, but this is nonetheless a significant milestone.
Well, it was a unique and multinational investigation involving the Met, but also those officers from the New York Police Department and from Canada. And in reaction to these convictions, we also heard from Rebecca Weiner, the Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD, who said that they'd taken out a leader, not just a foot soldier.
This is an incredibly significant verdict, not just here in the UK, but overseas as well. A prolific and shameless radicalizer like Anjem Choudary has managed to inspire, influence, and be involved in the radicalization of generations of individuals. Starting now, that won't continue.
Anjem Choudary radicalised the killer of Lee Rigby. He radicalised the London Bridge terror attackers in 2017. He radicalised Usman Khan, the man behind the terror attack on London Bridge, in 2019. He has been a significant director of terror radicalising in Britain in recent decades. But now, with his sentencing coming up a week today, he has been brought to justice.
Justice finally served on Anjem Choudary. An excellent summary. Thank you very much, Charlie Peters. Well, let's remind you of the news that the government will end the use of the Bibby Stockholm barge for housing migrants off England's south coast as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. The contract for the barge moored in Dorset will not be renewed past January, as demand for such accommodation will be reduced by moves to clear the backlog of asylum seekers, as announced by the Home Office yesterday. I can now speak with immigration lawyer Harjap Singh Bangal. Harjap, welcome to the show. Well, for many months, you and I have had this conversation. You thought the Bibi Stockholm was always a terrible solution. It wasn't required. The Home Secretary, the Labour Party, has agreed. It's been given the chop. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's an expensive gimmick. It didn't act as a deterrent. We had an episode where it was empty for a little while when there was legionnaires on it. Unfortunately, one person committed suicide or took his own life as a result of it. And it did nothing to clear the backlog. Whereas now this 20 million can be saved from January. And as Labour are doing, they're reinvesting into 1,000 new caseworkers to clear the 100,000 backlog. In fact, Angela Eagle, the Home Office Minister, she said to the MP, Lloyd Hatton, the South Dorset MP, that these people who are currently housed on the Bibi Stockholm, they're going to be processed as a matter of extreme urgency. So we're expecting them to be processed in a matter of weeks, not months and years, like they're being held on a barge. There's no point holding these migrants for months and years when they should be processed. And by processed, it doesn't mean letting them all live here. It actually, the Home Office referred to it yesterday, that the initial processing of the 100,000, they were going to try and assess and return those from safe countries such as India, what they deem as Pakistan, Nigeria, and Albania. So that's what they're looking to do, the government, and they're saving money for that as well, which was costing the taxpayers millions of pounds a year. And these contracts were signed with 3 companies for billions. So this is Labour sort of taking apart these contracts, and especially ones with a sort of whiff of the PPE sort of scandal around them, and saving money and putting them elsewhere, putting that money into clearing the backlog, which me and yourself have always called for. There's no reason why 100,000 claims, which each one should take about half a day or a day to assess, should be outstanding for years.
And yet, has this solved the problem? On the one hand, the Labour Party can say, hey, we've actually managed to stop a boat at last. The Bibi Stockholm, they've finally stopped a boat. There's no sign of the small boat stopping their arriving on the coast. In fact, they've gone up under the Labour Party. And so the next question, Harjap Singh Bangal, is if they're not going to be sent to Rwanda, if they're not going to live on a barge like the Bibi Stockholm, if next for the chop is RAF Scampton, RAF Wethersfield, that looks likely. We know they don't like the idea of hotels. And with a 62% success rate of asylum claims, the numbers coming to Britain won't come down. And I put it to you, what will happen instead? Angela Rayner said herself, every part of Britain will take their fair share of migrants. So what's happened here? The problem hasn't been solved. It's simply been moved, and it's coming to a street near people like you soon.
Well, the thing is, the proof will be in the pudding, and the pudding is the numbers. At the end of the day, we've always talked numbers on this channel, especially on your show, and the numbers will ultimately tell if the Labour government are successful in stopping this. We'll see what the Border Security Command actually does. Is it just a revamp of the same thing that we had, or will it be a total new system? There's a new deal that's been signed with Slovenia and Slovakia to stop the gangs, because that's a popular border from which people cross into Austria and into Germany. And let's also see about this 84 million invested into countries like Chad and Sudan, and see if that will stop. All of this is going to take time, but yeah, the proof once again, Martin, will be in the numbers and how Labour managed the numbers. But what is certain is that there needs to be removal of people who have been refused, and that was totally down under the previous government. So this government does recognise, look, we need to send people back. And as for boats, it did send one boat back last week. Under what circumstances, we're not sure. But that surely does show, look, hold on, we can turn around the boats, or we can manage this to some sort of level. Lawyers didn't stop that boat. Judges didn't stop that boat. The French didn't stop that boat. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. At the moment, it's a new government, new language. Will it work? Let's have a see. Let's see how many people are removed in a few months' time. Let's see how many numbers of people coming over are actually sent back. That will tell the tale, Martin.
Well, Harjap Singh Bangal, Nigel Farage gave his maiden speech in Parliament a short while ago. He said the last Labour government, the Tony Blair government under David Blunkett, they were tough. They sent people back. You and I have spoken about that often. He says he doesn't think the same thing will happen under this government due to the ECHR. We're going to have to leave it there. I've simply run out of time. But I know we're going to talk about this again sometime soon. Immigration lawyer Harjat Singh Bengal, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Now, coming up, we'll be heading to Paris to find out whether the Olympics could be the worst one ever, as 500,000 tickets still remain available, even for the much-coveted 100 metres final. People have got no interest in going to Paris. We'll find out why. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes, she could have said stump. You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
It went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Karen Stevenson was born in Stoke-on-Trent and read music at Trinity College, Cambridge. She's played cello with many of the world's great orchestras under the batons of some of the most renowned conductors, and she joins me now to discuss her career and the importance of music in education. Tell me about that. What is your role at the Philharmonia?
My role at the Philharmonia is number 2 cello. I've been there for about 15 years. Sometimes I play number 1 cello as well, which is a great opportunity for me.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I often think what a very difficult life it is to be a professional musician.
I make a living out of it. It is definitely possible. We don't really like it when we get into a taxi and someone says, "What's your day job?" Because we work really hard.
I was kind of making the opposite point. Not that you'd also have a day job. I think the perfection that is required for a professional musician is extraordinary. On the whole, we are intolerant of mistakes in classical music.
Yes, we are.
And I just wondered whether you don't become very frustrated with a world in which everything else is imperfect.
You are only as good as your last concert, Michael. That's how it feels. It is a lot of pressure. Sometimes we will say, OK, a pint for every wrong note or something, but if depending on the piece of music, that could be quite dangerous.
How many hours a day do you have to practice?
You have to practice much more when you're younger, I think, when you're learning. I think this is really important. And when you're at music college. I'm a busy, I'm travelling, I have a family. I can't practice as much as I used to, so you have to rely on your experience. What I really wanted to say is that there's been a lot of fear-mongering about classical music being in decline and it not being relevant. And I really wanted to say that I don't think that's the case. Our audiences have increased. They're the highest they've been in 10 years.
The People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQs live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQs live here on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Your time is 4:49. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, over 500,000 tickets remain unsold for this year's Paris Olympics. There are even tickets left for one of the most coveted events of all, the 100 metres final. But the Paris 2024 president dismisses any suggestions that ticket availability reflects lack of interest, adding that there are often big stadium events such as the football. But could the empty seats make Paris the worst Olympics in history? Well, Paris-based journalist Peter Allen joins me now. Peter, welcome to the show. So we last spoke about this topic a couple of weeks ago. It didn't look very rosy then. It looks worse now. 600,000 tickets still remain on sale, some at £15 a pop. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to watch non-league football at those sort of prices. What's going on? Why is there such little interest in the Paris Olympics?
Well, never say never, Martin. There's a couple of weeks to go, for example, until the 100 metres final. A lot of people start to get very interested when the publicity increases around particular runners or whatever. And there's still some confidence that they can be sold. What the organisers are saying is that they held certain tickets back to make it fair, so they weren't all sold a year in advance. A lot of people were buying them long ago, and they've got them already. But as you say, it is a bit strange that so many are available. Look at the opening ceremony on Friday. Can you believe they're still selling tickets for £900, the equivalent of, and upwards, even £2,000, to watch a load of barges on the Seine? And of course, nobody gets any medal, right? So they say a fool and his money is soon parted. Maybe there are a few Olympic fans still around who will spend that kind of money to come and watch. Who knows? We'll know, Martin.
But Peter, there are other issues too, and again, you and I have spoken about them before. That is the backdrop of social unrest. We saw after the parliamentary elections, there were scenes on the streets. There were riots between local lads, as you might call them, and the police. There was a story overnight of an Australian woman who was gang raped in a kebab shop in Paris just days before the Olympics starts. And then a hard left parliamentarian, Thomas Portes, beg your pardon, from the France Unbowed, the radical hard left party, saying Israeli athletes are not welcome at the Olympic Games. Politics, Palestine being brought into this, the threat of violence. Peter, Anna, is that also a part of the backdrop to the lack of interest?
I think it's always the backdrop to France, really, Martin. It's a revolutionary republic. It's one that's always full of violent dissent. Riots are very regular here, particularly on Saturdays, for example. And this kind of social turmoil is all part of it, really. There are paramilitary police all over Paris at all times, same with all the other major cities and towns. I can tell you this, I've been walking around central Paris this morning, and I think that if anybody tried anything, they would be arrested instantly. I mean, it really is like Fort Knox around here at the moment. Lots of streets have been shut off. There are more police around than there are ordinary pedestrians. Tourists are turning up without the regular passes that they need so you can get to their hotels. That's how secure it is. I mean, that in itself is quite alarming. I remember going to London 2012 and didn't experience anything like that kind of level of what some would say is reactionary, repressive security. But they really are taking it very, very seriously here. And despite the kind of threats that you outline, which again, I don't think are really much to do with the Olympics, they're to do with France. France is always, again, has this sort of undercurrent of turmoil, and it's more of the same as far as that's concerned. But I think the security operation is really quite extraordinary at the moment.
OK, thank you for joining us from Paris. Peter, Allen, let's hope everything goes peacefully. Of course, there was an Islamic State terror threat towards the Champions League quarter-final in Paris in April. Now, that's all for this hour, but don't go anywhere, because up next we'll get a reaction to the government sensationally scrapping the Bibi migrant march. But just where will they go next? Could they be coming to a street near you? I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel. That's your weather with Alex Deacon.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good afternoon. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, it's a fine evening out there. There are one or two showers around, but many places dry and fine with reasonably light winds. A few heavy showers across parts of eastern Scotland. One or two scattered showers for England and Wales, but they are very well scattered. Most places staying dry. Any showers fading away pretty sharply, so a dry night with decent clear spells. Quite a warm night across the south. Some towns and cities holding up at 15 or 16 degrees, a little cooler further north. Not much mist and fog, which means generally fine starts tomorrow. There will be some cloud here and there, but for many it'll be a day of good spells of sunshine. Like today, one or two showers likely to get going, particularly across parts of the east. And we are going to see the cloud increasing later across Northern Ireland. But still here for many, it's a dry and a fine start, as it will be across much of Scotland too. Temperatures soon starting to lift with the help of a little bit of sunshine, I suspect. The Murray Firth could get into the low 20s by the afternoon. Now, as we go through the day, we will see a bit more of the cloud bubbling up over parts of eastern England, Lincolnshire, down to Cambridgeshire. Chance of 1 or 2 showers here. Could even be the odd heavy one, but most areas staying dry. The main exception to that will be Northern Ireland, where cloud and rain will trickle in by lunchtime, and the west coast of Wales, likely to see some showery rain by the end of the afternoon. Same goes for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. But elsewhere, generally, we'll hang on to some spells of sunshine. Warmer than today as well, 25, 26, maybe 27 in London. It'll be cooler further west with a thicker cloud and the rain. That will pep up a little during the evening time. Some heavier bursts getting into western Scotland. That moves towards Shetland for the start of Thursday. And on Thursday, across the south, there will be some more wet weather coming in. Could be some heavy bursts of rain mixed in with this. Some heavy showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. In between, something a little bit drier. And generally, temperatures just dipping off a little bit by Thursday, back into the high teens or low 20s.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. In County Antrim, the M2 westbound is partially blocked due to an obstruction in the road. It's between junction 4 Sandy Nose and 5 for Temple Patrick. The usual stop-start traffic in Perth and Kinross for the M19 northbound up to the Broxton roundabout. The M6 northbound in Cheshire has a lane closed for an accident at junction 18 for Middlewich. Delays on the M25 anti-clockwise in Surrey. There's a lane closed for recovery work following an earlier vehicle fire just after junction 6 for Godstone. Queues on the M5 northbound and southbound in Somerset. There's a lane closed due to an accident on the northbound stretch at junction 22 Burnham-on-Sea. And queues on the M26 eastbound in Kent. There's a lane closed for emergency barrier repairs between junction 2A for Rootham and 3 for the M20. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
£30,000 in cash has to be won. It's our biggest cash prize so far, and it could be yours. Charles was a winner. Listen to what he says about winning the Great British Giveaway.
I'm Charles. I'm on £18,000 cash. It was just amazing, and as soon as it goes into your bank account, it just changed. It's a life-changing thing.
The next big winner could be you, with an extra £30,000 cash in your bank. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us. Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way. Might be cold in this studio. That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Tomorrow from 6, the legends of breakfast television are back together. Eamon Holmes and Anne Diamond. Only on GB News.
A very, very good afternoon to you. It's 5 p.m. Welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News. We're broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster, all across the UK. Coming up, after scrapping the Rwanda bill on day one, today the Labour Party has dramatically axed the Bibi Stockholm. Our asylum seeker camps at RAF Scampton and RAF Wethersfield next for the chop. But with no signs of illegal immigration coming down anytime soon, where will these people all be housed? Could they be coming to a street near you? Next up, the BBC has published its annual Fat Cat salary list, and once again, no surprises, Gary Lineker is top of the table on a whopping 1.35 million quid every year. But Hugh Edwards, who didn't even work last year due to being suspended, well, he trousered a £40,000 pay rise. Is it time to scrap the BBC licence fee? And yesterday, Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves said Britain has the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. Yet a new report seen exclusively by GB News shows Britain is actually beating the European Union on 3 key metrics: GDP, inflation and unemployment. And that asks the question, why does the new Labour government keep talking Britain down? And that's all coming up in your next hour. Welcome to the show. Always a delight to have your company. So the Labour Party, on day one, Rwanda got the chop. Now the Bibi Stockholm has got the chop. The RAF sites, they look likely to be next, but immigration isn't going down. In fact, the boats are going up. The Bibi Stockholm is the only boat the Labour Party has stopped, which adds the question, the big question, where do you think all these people will be housed? Angela Rayner said every community will need to take their fair share of asylum seekers. Is that something you're happy with? Get in touch all the usual ways, gbnews.com/your say. But now let's have your headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Martin, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB newsroom tonight is that in the United States, the head of the Secret Service has resigned today amid intense criticism of her handling of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Kimberly Cheatle admitted that the attempt on Donald Trump's life was, in her words, the most significant operational failure by the Secret Service for decades. She'd been testifying before a congressional committee yesterday, explaining her actions and saying she took full responsibility for what went wrong. Meanwhile, President Biden will address the nation from the Oval Office tomorrow to explain his plans for, as he puts it, finishing the job. He's understood to be returning to the White House today after several days out of the spotlight. And it comes as Kamala Harris asserts herself as the presumed nominee to face Republican Donald Trump. She's already secured the support of senior Democrats, including Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi and the Clintons. Her campaign has already raised over $80 million just a day after President Biden dropped out of the race for the White House. Now, as you've been hearing, here the government's going to shut down a barge used to house migrants off the south coast of England as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. Use of the Bibi Stockholm, which can house up to 500 men, began under the Conservative government. But human rights campaigners compared it to a prison ship and criticised its use as inhumane. The barge will continue to house migrants until the contract expires next year. That's longer than any longer than that would have cost the taxpayer more than £20 million. The Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. His trial found that he directed the group known as Al-Mujahirun for a significant period of time starting in 2014 and had encouraged support at online meetings of the Islamic Thinkers Society, a New York-based Islamist group. Dominic Murphy is head of counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police. He says today's verdict marks an important moment.
We know that Anjem Chowdary's had involvement with individuals that have committed terrorist attacks here in the UK in the past, but also travelled overseas to join ISIS. So actually disrupting Anjem Choudary and, of course, his group Al-Mujahirun, a prescribed organisation here under the Terrorism Act in the UK, will help us to manage public safety. But of course, you know, we need to keep a watchful eye on others that are involved in radicalisation. So our work won't stop here, but this is nonetheless a significant milestone.
Well, also news coming to us today that a police officer has been stabbed inside a prison near Durham. The officer, we understand, is conscious and talking in hospital following the incident, which happened this morning at Frankland Prison. That's according to Durham Police. He was visiting the Category A men's prison from an outside force. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, this afternoon has said she's appalled over the incident and that her thoughts are with the officer and his family. Charlotte Dujardin has withdrawn from the Olympics over a video from 4 years ago showing her making what she's called an error of judgment during a coaching session. The three-time Olympic dressage champion has had to pull out of all competitions whilst the incident is being reinvestigated. She said what happened was out of character and she's sorry for her actions at the time and is devastated to have let everybody down. Water companies will be expected to do far more to protect the health of Britain's waterways when new powers are given to the regulator. The Environment Secretary says a promised crackdown on water firms will include tougher fines for polluting and making sure money is properly invested into infrastructure rather than being paid out in bonuses for bosses. The Environment Agency reported 47 serious pollution incidents last year. That's up from 44 in 22. Steve Reid says that's unacceptable.
It would cost hundreds of billions of pounds to nationalise the water companies, and it would take years to unravel the current ownership models. I want to crack on and clean up the water as fast as we can. That is best done by giving the regulator the power, the teeth they need to stop these practices, and that includes the powers to make water bosses responsible for illegal pollution face criminal charges for the law breaking for which they are responsible.
Steve Reid. Now, the last remaining member of the Four Tops, whose music helped define the sound of Motown, has died at the age of 88. Abdul Fakir, who was known often as the Duke, was part of the quartet behind the string of hits throughout the 60s. In addition to that one, I Can't Help Myself, they also gave the world Reach Out, I'll Be There, and Baby, I Need Your Loving, all of which became hot hit parade classics. And he continued playing long after the group's heyday as well, completing his final tour just last year. Fellow musician Smokey Robinson has paid tribute to his friend, saying that Duke would carry on making heavenly music. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I'm back in half an hour. See you then.
Now we begin this hour with the massive news that the government will end the use of the home barge for housing migrants off England's south coast as part of an overhaul of the asylum system. The contract for the barge, moored in Dorset, will not be renewed past January, as demand for such accommodation will be reduced by moves to clear the asylum backlog, as announced by the Home Office yesterday. Now, the vessel was one of several sites, including the military bases, RAF Wethersfield in Essex and RAF Scampton. That's the site of the Dambusters, if you recall, in Lincolnshire, used by the previous Tory government in a bid to cut the cost of housing migrants in hotels. Well, I'm joined now by our Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Mark, welcome to the show. So, yeah, the clearest indication yet of the direction of travel for the Labour Party. Day one, Rwanda got the chop. Now, Bibi, well, at least that's one boat they've stopped. RAF camps looking like they'll get the chop too. Mark, the big question is, well, immigration isn't coming down anytime soon. The boats, if anything, are going up. They're coming in bigger and bigger numbers. So, Mark, that asks the question, where on earth would all these asylum seekers be housed?
And I can tell you that our producer in Kent is indicating that more migrants are due to arrive illegally across the English Channel in the next 24 hours, probably beginning on the evening tide later this evening, because those weather conditions in the Channel are settling down. And as sure as night follows day, when conditions improve, then those migrants come across the Channel, making that illegal journey. So, of course, what does the government then do with those who are continuing to come over here and adding to the asylum backlog? Well, their policy, it's very clear, it's their stated aim, is to rapidly diminish that asylum backlog until all those asylum applications have been dealt with, and along the way, end the use of the likes of the Bibi Stockholm barge, the RAF bases and the hundreds of hotels up and down the country. That will be welcomed by many people who've seen these hotels in particular going out of use for the local community. But the flip side of that, Martin, is you have to accommodate these people somewhere. Now, if they're granted asylum, they still have to be accommodated in the community, and that will fall to the local authorities right across the country to find room for them, probably in social housing stock. That makes social housing stock all the more limited for people in these local areas to access. And also there's the issue of processing people very quickly through the asylum system and then either granting them asylum or giving them leave to remain because you can't return them to a dangerous country, will act as a pull factor, critics say. It will just encourage more people to come across the channel because the people smugglers will be able to say to them, under a Labour government, you will get your application processed very quickly and likely then move into a nice council house somewhere around the country.
And Mark White, that then asks the very real question. Again, no surprises. It was their stated aim. Angela Rayner said on June the 26th, every part of Britain will take their fair share of migrants, along with that promise to build 1.5 million social houses. But asylum seekers, Mark White, will be eligible for that social housing. Social housing that is in short supply for British people already. Mark, is this really going to stop the problem, or is it simply going to dissipate and move the problem around working class communities, no doubt, around Britain?
Well, I think there's no doubt that as part of the stated policy now of the Labour government, then, you know, people will move throughout the country and be absorbed into local authority areas, and as a consequence they will have to be housed, and that will probably fall to council or social housing stocks and alike to make room for these people. Look, there are no easy solutions to this crisis, and the former Conservative government needs to answer some key questions as well about what on earth it was planning to do with that huge backlog of tens of thousands, up to 90,000 asylum seekers in the system as well, because they were just sat in limbo. They had passed a bill in the Commons that meant that anybody crossing the English Channel after after March 2023 was no longer eligible to claim asylum. So they were just stacking up in hotels. Well, the Labour government is passing a statutory instrument that will mean that those who have been in limbo in hotels will actually be processed. But in saying there's no easy solution to this, that is evident by the fact that you can process them more quickly, but in doing that, once the decision has been made, you're still left with what to do with them. Because, as you mentioned before, Martin, more than 60% of asylum applicants are granted asylum. That doesn't even begin to address the numbers who can't then be returned to their home countries because they're dangerous countries, that are then still given leave to remain. So the vast majority of people coming across the Channel do eventually just get to stay in this country.
You know, Mark White, Nigel Farage, a short while ago, gave his maiden speech in Parliament, and he said the previous Labour regime, under David Blunkett's Home Secretary, they were tough. They sent people back. He doesn't think the same thing will happen under this government because of the ECHR, Mark White. This one is going to roll and roll and roll. Thank you so much. Experts analysis, as ever, Mark White. Thank you. Now, it's just 19 days into the new government, and economists have warned that Labour's inflation-busting public sector pay proposals could cost an eye-watering £10 billion every year. With scrapping the two-child limit, an extra £2.4 billion on top of that per year. All of this adds up to an extra spending of an eye-watering £70 billion over the Parliament, and that's just two policies. So today's big question is, are bumper tax hikes inevitable? Are they on the way? And could Starmernomics cost you a packet? We'll have to discuss this further with the head of campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance, who joins me in the studio, Elliot Keck. Elliot, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as sure as night has followed day, people said, well, there'll be big public sector spending booms. That seems to be in the pipeline. And we either pay with that, with printing money. We can't do that. We're £2.7 trillion in debt. The magic money tree no longer exists. So the only way, surely, is tax rises.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, listen, during the election and for many months before, Rachel Reeves, and I think rightly, absolutely pledged ironclad fiscal discipline when she came into government. Unfortunately, and only a couple of weeks in, we're starting to see that discipline just starting to fray. And the figures we're talking about are mind-boggling. And the ultimate reality is we know that they'll have to raise tax in order to pay them unless they increase borrowing, which I don't think is feasible and would also go against their fiscal discipline pledge. And the only way to fund that through tax is going to be through the things like VAT, national insurance and income tax. Stuff like VAT on private schools is not going to pay for these pledges.
And the numbers involved are eye-watering. To pay for all of that alone would be the equivalent of like 3p on income tax. Now, they're not likely to do that. They're most likely to chase people who already have money. A lot of talk about capital gains, about inheritance tax. Do you think we're going to see that kind of tax movement? It's going to be a difficult statement in autumn for Rachel Reeves.
I think we may see movement on some of those taxes, but actually they're not going to raise the revenue. They're simply not going to raise the revenue. The Treasury's own estimates say that if you increase capital gains tax, it's unlikely to bring in extra revenue. In fact, many estimates that the Treasury put forward, and Rachel Reeves talks a lot about the sanctity of the OBR. A lot of these estimates say if you raise capital gains tax, you actually lose revenue. The only way you're going to bring in that sort of £70 billion over 5 years is if you do something like national insurance, income tax or VAT. And I do wonder if they may look at national insurance, which of course the last government cut by 4p, and say, well, we're going to restore that to what it was before. That would be what I would be looking out for.
And meanwhile, we're hearing Project Fear type messaging, a statement yesterday, we're in the worst situation since World War II. It feels like we're getting fluffed up, we're getting softened up for some pain.
Yeah, I mean, listen, clearly the economic situation is not a good one. Debt is at £2.7 trillion. It's over 100% GDP. We can debate about whether it's the worst since World War II. Certainly the tax burden is heading to the highest since World War II. But listen, either way, we knew things were bad before the election. The Labour Party knew things were bad before the election. This whole, now we've looked under the bonnet, things are worse than we thought. I don't think that is sustainable. But nevertheless, things are bad. And ultimately, if they're going to increase spending in the way that many of their backbenchers are demanding, we just saw, UNRWA funding increase by £21 million in the last couple of weeks. They're going to have to start rising taxes.
They talk about growing their way out of it. We don't really seem to get a lot of detail. Elliot, what about things like actually cutting tax on corporation tax to make Britain more productive, more attractable, more worthy of inward investment from abroad?
Well, we know that cuts to corporation tax do wonders for growth. There's a good reason for that. Corporation tax is paid by employees through lower wages. It's paid by consumers through higher prices, and it's paid by shareholders through lower dividends. So we know that cutting corporation tax would be an excellent way to boost growth. Unfortunately, that's not in the Labour Party's ideology. It's not in their way of thinking. They view business as not something to be celebrated to quite the same extent as others. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. But what I'd be saying to this current government is definitely don't make things worse. And that means they're going to have to stand up to some of those pay demands.
And you talked about capital gains tax. It doesn't net the revenue. Quite simply, if we learn anything from the bad old days of the 1970s, if you squeeze the pips, people flee the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, the only places where you can really reliably raise a lot of revenue is income tax on ordinary working people, national insurance on ordinary working people, and VAT, the sort of taxes that people actually cannot avoid, cannot find ways around, and taxes on people that don't have the ability to simply leave the country. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're heading to. OK, thank you very much for joining us. And that's Elliot Keck, who's the head of campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you in the studio. Now, still plenty of time to grab your chance to win £30,000 in the Great British Giveaway. It's our biggest cash prize of the year, and it's completely tax-free. Now, what would you do with all that extra dough? Well, here's how you could win the lot.
Don't miss your chance to win our Super Summer Giveaway. With your chance to win £30,000 cash, our biggest cash prize to date, which means you get to spend every single penny however you like. What plans would you make with an extra £30,000 cash in your bank account? Take your family on the ultimate holiday, buy that treat that's always seemed out of reach, or just put it in the bank for a later date. However you'd spend it, make sure you don't miss out. For another chance to win £30,000 £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2 or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Good stuff. Fill your boots. Now, don't go anywhere because we'll be discussing the US Secret Service director who has sensationally resigned over the security alerts during the Trump assassination attempt following a brutal grilling from a congressional committee yesterday. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel. If you want your news to be straight talking, this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Tom, dying to talk to you about this. Transport for London, right? They run the buses and tubes and things in London. And they've got £2.5 million. £2.5 million, which they're going to spend on what?
Diversity training. I dare say they've probably got plenty of it already.
But let me tell you something. I sit on a board of a company and I was diversity trained recently.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, really?
And I must admit,
What was that like?
Well, I tell you, it was like stating the bleeding obvious.
Yeah.
Right? So you sit there and you say, well, why would I do that? Or why would I treat someone like that? I wouldn't do that in the first place. I don't need to be trained in this. And you just sat there for 6 hours while people told you the obvious. But what do you think of spending that amount of money for Transport for London?
It's crazy because, on the one hand, do we need this diversity training? The TfL is an incredibly diverse workforce already. The idea that there are barriers to entry there doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Also, as you say, these things are commonsensical, really. And to the point, sometimes they can become problematic because they're not just saying, you know, be open and tolerant of people and so on. It's actually preaching a more kind of divisive sort of rhetoric to people, which can be a big problem in the
get your
workplace.
diversity training from your boss or somebody, don't you? Somebody pulls you up and says, you don't talk to people like that. This is how you talk to them. That's it. Done.
It should be that
spend
simple.
6 hours in front of
And I know that in the grand scheme of things, £2.5 million is kind of money down the back of the sofa. But at the same time, my local tube station just closes early on random nights of the week because of the fact that they haven't got enough staff.
4 years ago, there were 655 people at City Hall earning over £100,000 a year. People might argue that's 655 too many. There are 1,100 now. 4 years later.
1,100?
Actually, 1,142 to be precise.
The People's Channel.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets and My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tomorrow from 6, the legends of breakfast television are back together. Eamon Holmes and Anne Diamond, only on GB News.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Your time is 5:24. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. The director of the US Secret Service has resigned from her post after the agency was heavily criticised following the assassination attempt on Donald Trump on July the 13th. Kimberly Cheetle was subjected to an absolutely brutal cross-examination before a House committee yesterday, during which she was accused of cutting corners on the former president's security and was told she would have been culpable if Donald Trump had been killed. Committee members also became very frustrated at her apparent inability to answer even the most basic of questions. Well, I'm joined now by GBNews reporter Ray Addison. Ray, welcome to the show. The session yesterday we carried live on GB News, it was astonishing. It was savage. I've never seen anything like it. And she couldn't answer basic questions. Ray, there's one in particular that she was asked that made the entire auditorium gasp with disbelief. She said, she was asked, why was the president allowed to take to the stage when you knew a suspicious man was on the roof? And she answered, in all seriousness, she answered, we didn't know he was dangerous. Ray, with answers like that, incompetence shining through, there's small wonder that 24 hours on, she's fallen on her sword and resigned.
No, just like President Biden had to go inevitably after that disastrous debate performance with former President Trump, it was inevitable that she would have to go as well. And we understand that she has sent an email to her staff within the last hour or so saying, I take full responsibility for the security lapse. In light of recent events, it's with a heavy heart that I've made the difficult decision to step down as your director. I'm not sure, Martin, that it was that difficult a decision. It was clear that she had to take responsibility. And this really is a secret service that is in crisis now. It's the most significant operational failure since then President Ronald Reagan was shot back in 1981. You say she wasn't able to answer questions. She refused to provide details about the incident, the handling of the security perimeter, what officials knew of potential threats, the decisions they made when they did know, and, of course, the suspicious behaviour of the suspect. And it was untenable for her. President Biden has responded saying that he was grateful to Cheetle for her decades of public service, and he's now saying that he's going to appoint a new director of the Secret Service. But questions may be asked over that. Does he have a legitimate right as the outgoing president to choose the person in charge of that crucial role? You may find that Kamala Harris, who's now, of course, the presumptive nominee for the Democrats, she may want to select her own person. Of course, if Donald Trump wins the election in November, he may want to replace that person as well. Now, he's commented as well in the last hour. He's tweeted saying, the Biden-Harris administration did not properly protect me, and I was forced to take a bullet for democracy. It was my great honour to do so. But we also hear that we're going to be hearing from President Biden. He'll be speaking on Wednesday evening in the United States. That's 1 a.m. UK time, and he's bound to address all of the events of the very busy last 48 hours.
And Ray Addison, there were lots of questions asked yesterday about was resource turned down for political reasons. She dodged those questions, but some of the most basic questions she didn't have the answers to, Ray, were simply astonishing. Did the Secret Service have an agent on that roof, she was asked. I can't answer that question. It's an ongoing investigation. Ray, at that point, the audience were laughing. They were openly laughing at her. She embarrassed her office. She embarrassed herself. And then it culminated in somebody saying, because Donald Trump is alive, you look incompetent. If he died, you'd be culpable. Biden needs to fire you. That didn't need to happen in the end, Ray. She's done the right thing.
It was the only option that she had. It wasn't her decision. It was a decision that was made for her. We saw her appear at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee while Donald Trump was there, while he was speaking, and she was followed around by various senators demanding answers. And of course, you know, she was saying at the time, I'm due to appear in front of this committee, and yet then she goes there and she doesn't provide even the most basic answers. And they were pointing out to her in that committee, and this is not just Republican Republicans, this is Democrats too, pointing out to her, you have had 9 days to find the answers to these questions, and you have completely failed to do so. It appears that she was either uninterested or, some would argue, too incompetent to even ask those right kinds of questions. And that doesn't make any sense, because she had been with the Secret Service for 20 years on and off before working for PepsiCo in a security role and then coming back appointed by President Biden to that role. Well, he appointed, it would appear, the wrong person, and he's about to appoint somebody else now. And questions will be asked as to whether he's got the right judgment to choose the right person for that crucial job.
It's a valid question, and lots of other questions will be asked about, was she a diversity hire? Was she the right person for the job, or was she simply the right woman for the job? And yesterday, Ray, when she said, I'm here today because I want to answer questions, and one of the congressmen simply said, I don't think you've answered a single question here today. Ray Addison, it was like a career assassination, if you pardon the pun. She's gone. Kimberly Cheadle, history. Thank you very much for joining us, Ray Addison. There's lots more still to come between now and 6 o'clock, and we'll discuss the BBC report, which shows that Hugh Edwards has become the BBC's third highest paid presenter last year, with a 40 grand pay rise despite being suspended for 9 months. But first, it's your latest news headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
The headlines this hour: the Islamist preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation. His trial found that he'd directed Al-Mujahirun group for a significant period of time, starting in 2014, and had also encouraged support for it by addressing online meetings of the Islamic Thinkers Society. Also today, the government says it will shut down a barge used to house migrants off the south coast of England as part of its overhaul of the asylum system. Use of the Bibby Stockholm barge, which can house up to 500 men, began under the Conservative government. Human rights campaigners, though, have compared it to a prison ship and criticised it as inhumane. And Charlotte Dujardin has withdrawn from the Olympics over a video from 4 years ago showing her making what she called an error of judgment during a dressage coaching session. The three-time Olympic dressage champions had to pull out of all competitions whilst the incident is being reinvestigated. She said she was sincerely sorry for her actions, which were out of character, and is devastated to have let everyone down. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Biden says he'll address the nation from the Oval Office tomorrow to explain his plans for what he calls finishing the job. It comes as Kamala Harris, his vice president, asserts herself as the presumed Democrat nominee to face Republican Donald Trump in November. She's already secured the support of senior Democrats, including the president, Nancy Pelosi, and the Clintons, and that has paved the way for her campaign to raise over $80 million in just 24 hours, just a day after Joe Biden dropped out of the race for the White House. Those are the latest news headlines from the GB Newsroom. I'm Polly Middlehurst. I'm back in half an hour with more news. See you then.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Polly. Now, notorious Islamist hate preacher Anjem Choudary has been found guilty of directing a terrorist organisation and encouraging support for it through online meetings. Following a trial at Woolwich Crown Court, Choudary was convicted of taking a caretaker role in directing the hate group. And let's get the latest now with GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, Anjem Choudary has long dodged justice. Today, it finally came. Tell us more.
Well, Anjem Choudary is facing life in prison after almost 30 years of living off state benefits while promoting violent jihad, while calling for Islamist political violence and radicalising scores of terrorists who have caused mayhem on streets in Britain, but also overseas. He has been a radicalizer who has called on people to join the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. That's what he was previously in jail for from 2016 to 2018. His licence conditions expired in 2021, and that's when this prosecution, which successfully argued this now, said that he started promoting Al-Muhajirun, the terrorist group that he was a caretaker of while the leader, Omar Bakri Mohammed, was in prison in Lebanon, started giving lectures for them to their North American branch, the Islamic Thinkers Society, based in New York. We were able to understand that Anjem Choudary had been running this group due to his links with the Islamic Thinkers Society, and in particular, his links with his personal assistant, Khalid Hussein, a 29-year-old Canadian who was arrested when he landed in London last year on a flight from Canada. He was said to be involved in organising Anjem Chowdary's speeches in the United States, often delivered via encrypted platforms, his online lectures where he called on people to encourage themselves and encourage the support for Al-Muhajirun, the proscribed terrorist organisation. Well, how did we understand the extent of Anjem Chowdary's involvement with this group, and how did we establish the links between the Islamic Thinkers Society and Al-Muhajirun? Well, it was achieved through the New York Police Department and the Canadian police infiltrating the society through their undercover officers. And Khalid Hussein actually sent one of those officers a voice message establishing what was a crucial piece of evidence showing the links between ALM in Britain and ITS in New York.
And of course, just to like make sure with you that, you know, like I don't want to cause problems for other people if they don't even believe in, you know, in these issues. I mean, obviously, like, we're basically, you know, right now this isn't something that's general. We defend the prisoners, you know, especially the ulama who are in prison, like Sheikh Omar and Sheikh Nasser. But I just, you know, because it is coming from me, so I just, and, you know, most people don't know I'm part of Al-Muhajirun or who the Islamic Thinkers Society are anyway, so that's why I don't usually care, but turned out you kind of knew, like, based on our conversations on iMessages the other day, it kind of seemed that you already knew who Al-Muhajirun were, so I didn't want to cheat you, you know what I mean? That's pretty much it.
And Charlie, of course, he called himself Anjem Choudary, the #1 radicaliser in Britain. And he indeed went on to radicalise in some terrible ways, including radicalising the murderer of Lee Rigby.
That's right, Martin. The murder of Lee Rigby, but also several other terror attackers in Britain. The London Bridge attackers from 2017 and Usman Khan, who murdered 2 at Fishmongers Hall off London Bridge in 2019. He has been central to the Islamist issue in Britain for several decades. The UK intelligence community and its wider counter-terrorism partners have seen disrupting Anjem Choudary and denying opportunities for Al-Muhajirun as a key objective over that period because he has been so influential. And it's through this unique and historic partnership with American colleagues and Canadians that they've managed finally to bring him behind bars again following that 2016 conviction for supporting ISIS. And it was that they managed to establish the links between Al-Muhajirun and the Islamic Thinkers Society. As you heard in that voice note a moment ago, played out of Khalid Hussein speaking to someone he thought he could trust. He thought he was speaking to a fellow Islamist. In fact, he was speaking to an undercover officer who had goaded Khalid Hussein into admitting that Al-Muhajirun was active in the United States, that it was still ongoing, that it was an active group. This evidence was vital to achieving these 3 convictions on Anjem Choudary of being a member, of encouraging support and, crucially, directing a terrorist organisation. That's Section 56 charge. It's extremely rare. We haven't had one in the British courts since 2008 when a key ringleader for Al-Qaeda in Britain was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. Anjem Choudary will be sentenced a week today. He could face the same fate.
Charlie Peters, an excellent summary as ever. Thank you very much for joining us on GB News. Now, plenty more coming in just a moment, and if you want to get in touch, simply go to gbnews.com/your say, and I'll try and read out the best of your messages a little later in the show. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, it's a fine evening out there. There are 1 or 2 showers around, but many places dry and fine with reasonably light winds. A few heavy showers across parts of eastern Scotland. 1 or 2 scattered showers for England and Wales, but they are very well scattered. Most places staying dry. Any showers fading away pretty sharply, so a dry night with decent clear spells. Quite a warm night across the south. Some towns and cities holding up at 15 or 16 degrees, a little cooler further north. Not much mist and fog, which means generally fine starts tomorrow. There will be some cloud here and there, but for many it'll be a day of good spells of sunshine. Like today, 1 or 2 showers likely to get going, particularly across parts of the east. And we are going to see the cloud increasing later across Northern Ireland. But still here for many, it's a dry and a fine start, as it will be across much of Scotland too. Temperatures soon starting to lift with the help of a little bit of sunshine. I suspect the Moray Firth could get into the low 20s by the afternoon. Now, as we go through the day, we will see a bit more of the cloud bubbling up over parts of eastern England, Lincolnshire, down to Cambridgeshire. Chance of 1 or 2 showers here. Could even be the odd heavy one, but most areas staying dry. The main exception to that will be Northern Ireland, where cloud and rain will trickle in by lunchtime. And the west coast of Wales, likely to see some showery rain by the end of the afternoon. Same goes for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. But elsewhere, generally, we'll hang on to some spells of sunshine. Warmer than today as well. 25, 26, maybe 27 in London. It'll be cooler further west with a thicker cloud and the rain. That will pep up a little during the evening time. Some heavier bursts getting into western Scotland. That moves towards Shetland for the start of Thursday. And on Thursday, across the south, there will be some more wet weather coming in. Could be some heavy bursts of rain mixed in with this. Some heavy showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. In between, something a little bit drier. And generally, temperatures just dipping off a little bit by Thursday, back into the high teens or low 20s.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. In County Antrim, the M2 westbound is partially blocked due to an accident between junction 4 Sandy Knolls and 5 for Temple Patrick. The M60 clockwise in Manchester, we're seeing queuing traffic there between junction 10, the Trafford Centre, and 13 for Worsley. Slow for the M6 northbound in Cheshire. There's a lane closed for an accident at junction 18 for Middlewich. Long delays on the M25 anti-clockwise in Surrey due to an earlier vehicle fire just after junction 6 for Godstone. Long delays on the A34 southbound near Winchester. It's partially blocked due to recovery work for a broken down van. Congestion almost back to South Wanston. And queues in Kent on the M26 eastbound. There's a lane closed for emergency barrier repairs between junction 2A for Rootham and 3 for the M20. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Welcome back. Your time is 5:42. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, throughout the show, I've been asking you for your comments, your say. You've been getting in touch on the speech. Nigel Farage gave his maiden speech earlier on in Parliament. A few of you have been commenting on that. Cough says this. I've just watched Nigel on GB News speaking in Parliament. He says it exactly as it is. He and the other 4 Reform MPs represent a substantial swathe of Britain on these issues. After this Parliament and Labour government is done with, I suspect there'll be many more Reform MPs. Thank you for that. I'll read some more out before the end of the show, but let's move on now, because the BBC has published its annual report today, revealing their biggest earners. Gary Lineker, once again, no surprises. He's the broadcaster's best paid presenter, taking home a whopping £1.35 million each year. But Hugh Edwards is also amongst the BBC's highest paid fat cats of the last year. The former newsreader's salary increased by £40,000 despite being suspended since last July. 40 grand for doing nothing on top of his already fat pay packet. Well, I'm joined now by the former BBC journalist Danny Kelly. Danny, welcome to the show. So it's an annual event, one we don't especially like much. The big cats are wheeled out, the top pay. No surprises, Gary Lineker is the top of the pile once again. But Hugh Edwards, how on earth can he continue to get such a massive salary and a 40 grand pay rise? He hasn't worked since last July.
You're right. He was on sick leave for 9 months during the scandal with his mental health, and he was given like a 10% pay rise. But that's not unusual, Martin, because Radio 2 presenters have been given 25, 30 grand pay rises, whilst 500 members of staff have been told that they're going to lose their jobs because they've got to save £200 million. So roughly 40k a staff role, they've got to lose 500, yet Radio 2 presenters have been given 25, 30 grand pay rises. There's a lad who's just been given the early breakfast show on Radio 2. He used to read the weather at Manchester Television, BBC Manchester. He's on £200,000, Martin. Now, are you telling me that that lad wouldn't do it for like 65, 70, £80,000? And that's the problem with the BBC. The perception and the optics are terrible. £200,000 for an inexperienced radio presenter when people are losing their jobs. £30,000 pay rise for people like Sarah Cox, who is a fabulous presenter. But if I was in charge of Radio 2, I would say to Sarah Cox, look, Sarah, you're brilliant, but I don't think you have an alternative. I don't think there's another radio station that's knocking on your door. So unfortunately, you're going to have to take, rather than a 30 grand pay rise, we're going to cut your salary to 40 or 50 grand. It's the sort of thing Alan Sugar should run. A commercial radio station wouldn't be paying these people £250,000, £300,000 because they know there's not a viable alternative, Martin. And that's the problem.
But that probably won't happen anytime soon because common sense doesn't seem to catch on at the BBC. And of course, Danny, these conversations always then turn around to the BBC licence fee. Now, do you think, Danny, that the BBC licence fee, the model, is safer now that we have a Labour government in place?
I don't, Martin, and I've qualified that. A recent study told us that 69% of 16-year-olds consume BBC products. So 31% of 16-year-olds do. Now, people will be saying, well, what's that? How is that relevant? They're 16. Well, I'll tell you why it's relevant, because in 10 years' time, the BBC will be expecting their £169 a year licence fee when they move out of mum and dad's. Over 55, if you're over 55 years of age, 96% of people are loyal to the BBC. That's why if you turn on the BBC radio or television, everything's aimed at young people. The Labour government, I think, Martin, the Labour government have had a bit of a reality check with this election, and a lot of hard left Labour supporters are saying, well, we can't see the difference between the Conservatives and Labour. And Labour aren't soft. They want another general election success in 4 or 5 years' time. So I don't think the BBC is safe. I think the funding model is very insecure. Gary Lineker's got 12 months left of his contract. I think hell will freeze over before the BBC give him another contract because he's harming the licence fee, just him being there with his political activism online. I love Lineker, the footballer. I'm an Everton fan, but I don't like Gary Lineker, the political activist. And Labour aren't blind to this, Martin. Labour aren't soft. They know about this.
OK, Danny Kelly, many people will agree with you there, nodding along furiously at tea time. Thank you very much, Danny Kelly. Always a pleasure. Now, coming up, the UK is ahead of the European Union in 3 key economic areas: GDP, unemployment and inflation. But why, oh why, does it feel as if the Labour government are continually talking Brexit Britain down? We'll discuss that next. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes, she could have said Stump. You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
In World War I, 309 men from Britain and the Commonwealth never came home because they'd been shot at dawn. The majority were killed for desertion, cowardice and sleeping at post. Appearing at their court-martials and told they'd brought shame on their country, these men had no opportunity to defend themselves and were executed by a firing squad. The National Memorial Arboretum launched a fundraising campaign to restore the memorial, which has stood for more than 20 years.
Thank you to your viewers for their support for the fundraising campaign. And thanks to the generosity of so many people, we've been able to replace all 309 of the posts that represent those young men that were shot in the First World War. Restoration of this really precious memorial.
The centrepiece of the memorial is the young soldier, blindfolded and facing his execution. In September 1916, Private Harry Farr was ordered to the front. Already suffering from shell shock, he was overwhelmed and refused his orders. he was court-martialed, and in a trial lasting only 20 minutes, he was sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, he faced the firing squad without a blindfold. Janet Booth is Private Farr's granddaughter and was part of the public campaign to have those who were shot at dawn officially pardoned.
When I asked my gran, do you know where I could find Harry's grave? And she looked at my mother, and there was this sort of look between them, and then she said, well, he hasn't got a grave because they didn't warrant, he deserved one because he was shot as a coward and had let his country down. We can come here as a family and pay our respects to him, and also for all the other families, it's somewhere to come and remember their loved ones.
The People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back, 5:50, the final furlong. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, here's a question for you. Why does the new Labour government keep on talking down the United Kingdom? Because according to the latest statistics, the UK is ahead of the European Union in three key economic areas: GDP, unemployment and inflation. So bearing that in mind, why does Sir Keir Starmer's government continue to insist that Britain and its economy are in such dire straits? Let's get the thoughts now of the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound, and great friend of the channel. Stephen, yesterday we heard from Chancellor Rachel Reeves, whoever won the election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. But the data paints a different picture. Data came out yesterday, not reported on the BBC, quelle surprise, and that is the UK is ahead on inflation, GDP, unemployment, GDP 0.7% in the UK, 0.3% in the EU, almost twice as high here. 2% inflation here versus 2.6% in the EU. Unemployment in the UK, 4.4%, 6% in the EU. Brexit, Britain is trouncing Brussels. Why don't we ever hear a good word about Britain?
Well, to be honest, Martin, if only it was trouncing Britain. Look, let's get a couple of things absolutely straight. First of all, every single party, either side, that criticises it was always accused of talking down Britain. And let me just tell you one thing. If our economy was in this golden state with money pouring in everywhere, do you honestly think that Rishi Sunak wouldn't have hung on till the autumn when, if it's such a great economy, then he could have had tax cuts? He didn't have tax cuts. He knew it could only get worse. Here's the reality. We are growing against some of the other European countries from a much lower base. We still have a huge problem. We are massively, massively overexposed in this country. Do you know, 82% of our GDP is actually in the financial services sector. We make nothing in this country. There is no engineering, there's no shipbuilding, there's no car manufacturing, there's no steel making. What little there is owned by either Tata or Volkswagen or other companies. We are horrendously overexposed in this country to the remote possibility, or the real possibility rather, of our financial services moving to Frankfurt or Paris, hopefully not to Paris after all the chaos that they've been suffering. But the reality is that our GDP, after 2 consecutive quarters of decline, of actually recession, is finally moving upwards. And credit where credit's due. Inflation is steady at 2%, I'm delighted to say that, and our unemployment is at a pretty reasonable level. But the reality is that our GDP growth, compared to the global average, which is at least 6%, if you actually look at the World Bank figures, is actually nothing to shout about. If anything, it's a criticism of the rest of Europe rather than a pat on the back for good old GB.
Now, Stephen, got a quick 20 seconds here. Isn't the reality that every government is talking down the economy because they want to soften us up for tax hikes?
No, that simply isn't the case. There's nothing to be gained from anybody being unpatriotic. There's nothing to be gained from anybody trying to give a false prospectus. If we were not giving, the Labour Party was not giving accurate information, we would be blown out of the water at the earliest opportunity. I'm sorry, Rachel Reeves is a very sober, sensible, serious former Bank of England economist, and I happen to say I believe her more than some of these, I'm backing Brexit websites. Sorry, mate.
All right, well, let's leave it there, Stephen Pound. That remains to be seen. I reckon we'll get tax hikes. Let's see. Call me Mystic Martin. Thank you, Stephen Pound. Always a pleasure. That's all from me for now. Jubes & Co, of course, is up next. Don't forget to join from 6 a.m. tomorrow. It's breakfast with Eamon and Isabel, followed by Britain's Newsroom at 9:30 with Andrew and Bev. And then, of course, Tom and Emily with Good Afternoon Britain from midday. Now, I'm back tomorrow at 3. In fact, I'm back tonight, 7 till 8, coming in from Nigel Farage. I'm Martin Daubney, and this is GB News. But now it's time for your weather, and it's Alex Deakin. Have a great evening.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good afternoon. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, it's a fine evening out there. There are 1 or 2 showers around, but many places dry and fine with reasonably light winds. A few heavy showers across parts of eastern Scotland. 1 or 2 scattered showers for England and Wales, but they are very well scattered. Most places staying dry. Any showers fading away pretty sharply, so a dry night with decent clear spells. Quite a warm night across the south. Some towns and cities holding up at 15 or